Chapter 1. The Turning of the Tide. There are few moments in the vast annals of galactic history more fraught with consequence than the final days of the 29th millennium. The Eldar Empire, masters of the stars for 60 million years, stood at the precipice of a catastrophe so complete that its very soul trembled on the edge of damnation. Yet in that darkest hour, when pleasure-drunk nobility cavorted through halls of perversion, and the psychic winds of the warp screamed with gathering hunger, a handful of souls looked into the abyss and chose to turn away. The Farseer Council of Ulthwé had not convened in full session for 3 millennia. Now, as the great dome of Wraithbone pulsed with urgent light, 13 of the craft world's most gifted seers gathered around the ancient seeing stone. Eldrad Ulthran, youngest among them, yet bearing wisdom that cut like a blade, gazed into the swirling depths where futures danced like dying stars. "The vision comes clearer with each passing day," Eldrad whispered, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. "The birth scream approaches. The Prince of Pleasure stirs in the realm beyond reality." Farseer Taldir, her silver hair gleaming in the Wraithbone's ethereal glow, leaned forward. The paths of fate had become a labyrinth of shadow and pain, each strand leading to the same terrible conclusion. The pleasure cults consume another world each week. Komaruk itself writhes with such excess that the barrier between realms grows thin as gossamer. Yet even as the seers spoke of doom, their voices carried not despair, but grim resolve. For they had seen something else in the tangled web of possibility, a single thread of defiance that gleamed like adamantine among the rot. The emergency beacon that pulsed from Ulthwé's heart reached across the galaxy, cutting through the webway's ancient pathways to find those who might still answer. On distant Eandon, Farseer Kelman felt the call echo through the infinity circuit and knew that the hour of choosing had come. From Biltan's warrior halls, Farseer Therianna gathered her most trusted warlocks and stepped through hidden gates. Even from mighty Alatok, where isolation was doctrine, Farseer Kaelin emerged from decades of meditation to heed the summons. The gathering that convened in Ulthwé's council chambers 3 days later was unlike any in the Empire's memory. Not since the war in heaven had so many craft world leaders stood together, their combined psychic might making the very air shimmer with power. Yet for all their strength, they faced an enemy that dwelt not in the material realm, but in the hearts of their own people. "Speak plainly, Eldrad," commanded Spirit Seer Eanna from her position at the chamber's heart. "What have your visions revealed?" Eldrad's response came not in words, but in psychic projection, images that seared themselves into every mind present. They saw the core worlds of the Empire writhing in pleasure-drunk madness. They witnessed noble houses that had guided civilization for eons, reduced to competing in acts of depravity that defied comprehension. They felt the psychic resonance building in the warp, a crescendo of sensation and emotion that would birth something monstrous. "The corruption spreads faster than wildfire," Farseer Kelman said grimly. "Housevect controls half of Komarah's districts. The Court of the Archon has declared that pain and pleasure are the only truths worth pursuing. Even the Mon-Keek worlds we oversee report our people engaging in acts that shame our species." Farseer Therianna's hand rested on her singing spear, her warrior's instincts recognizing a threat that could not be fought with blade or bolt. "Then we cut out the corruption before it consumes us all. The pleasure cults must be destroyed, their leaders scattered to the void." But Eldrad shook his head, his ancient eyes reflecting the weight of possibility. "Destruction alone will not suffice. The resonance has already begun. Even if we cleansed every corrupted world tomorrow, the psychic momentum would carry forward. We need not just purification, but transformation. The silence that followed, stretched taut as a wire. In that moment, the assembled leaders of the most advanced civilization in the galaxy faced a truth that challenged everything they believed. Their people's very nature, their passion, their intensity, their ability to experience sensation beyond the comprehension of lesser races, had become the instrument of their potential doom. "The paths," whispered Farseer Kalin, her voice carrying sudden understanding. "We must create the paths." The concept crystallized in the chamber like a lightning bolt made manifest. Where their ancestors had pursued every experience without restraint, believing themselves beyond consequence, the future would demand discipline, structure, the channeling of their nature's fire into forms that would not consume them. Yet even as hope flickered to life, the first echoes of resistance reached them through the webway's hidden channels. Prince Vector's forces had already begun mobilizing, sensing that change was in the wind. The pleasure cults would not surrender their dominion without a war that would shake the galaxy's foundations. Eldrad rose from his seat, his form radiating the authority of one who had gazed into the heart of necessity and found his purpose. "We stand at the turning of the tide. Our people face extinction or transformation. There is no middle path, no compromise with the darkness that stirs." The die was cast. The war for the Eldar Empire's soul was about to begin. But in the depths of Comera, where shadow-drunk nobility counted pleasure in screams and measured power in the depths of depravity they could fathom, other plans were already in motion. The corruption would not yield easily to reformation. And somewhere in the howling depths of the warp, something vast and hungry stirred, waiting for the moment of its birth. The future balanced on a knife's edge, and the choice of which way it would fall lay in the hands of a dying empire's final guardians. Chapter 2. The Great Purification. The first strike came at dawn on the world of Shar-Dur, where the cult of the Crimson Ecstasy had turned an entire continent into a sprawling amphitheater of depravity. Aspect warriors materialized from the webway like vengeful spirits, their white armor blazing with righteous purpose as they swept through halls where noble Eldar had forgotten the meaning of dignity. The howling banshees led the assault, their war cry shattering crystal pillars that had witnessed unspeakable acts, while fire dragons burned away the corruption with cleansing flame. Autarch Theron of Mymeara spoke no words of warning or mercy as his forces advanced through the palace districts. The time for negotiation had passed, with the last rational thought of those who dwelt within these tainted halls. Yet even as his warriors cut down the pleasure-mad cultists, he felt the weight of what they destroyed. These were not alien enemies or mindless beasts, but their own people, Eldar who had chosen sensation over wisdom and paid the ultimate price. Across the galaxy, the coordinated strikes unfolded like a symphony of steel and fire. On Lugganath Prime, striking scorpions emerged from hidden positions to assault the Palace of Exquisite Sorrows. The defenders, their minds addled by millennia of excess, fought with desperate fury, but lacked the discipline that had once made the Eldar race supreme. Where they had weapons, the reformers had strategy. Where they had numbers, the reformers had righteousness. But it was in the dark heart of Comera that the true war would be decided. The great port city sprawled through the webway like a cancer of shadow and splendor, its impossible architecture defying the laws of physics as it twisted through dimensions that lesser races could not comprehend. Here, in the spaces between reality, the corruption had grown strongest. Prince Vect's forces controlled vast districts where pain and pleasure were currency, and the very air seemed to whisper with promises of forbidden delights. Farseer Eldrad stood at the threshold of the webway gate, his staff crackling with psychic energy as he prepared to lead the assault on the city that had once been the crown jewel of their civilization. Behind him, warriors from every loyal craft world had gathered, an army not of conquest, but of reclamation. "Remember," he spoke to the assembled host, his voice carrying across ranks of guardians and aspect warriors, "we fight not to destroy, but to preserve. Every soul we can turn from this path of damnation is a victory against the darkness that seeks to claim us all." The battle for Commorragh began with silence. Eldrad's psychic might reached out like an invisible tide, disrupting the pleasure circuits that fed the city's addiction networks. Across 1,000 districts, the artificial euphoria that had sustained the corrupt nobles for generations suddenly ceased. In that moment of withdrawal and clarity, some few remembered what they had been before the fall into excess. They would become the first to embrace the new way that was being forged in blood and determination. Yet Prince Vecht was no mere pleasure-drunk fool. The being who would one day be known as the supreme overlord of the Dark City had already sensed the change in the wind. From his spire palace in the city's heart, his forces deployed with tactical precision that spoke of a mind still sharp, despite its corruption. Kabbalite warriors took positions in the narrow bridges that spanned the webway's void, while witch cults prepared to turn the coming battle into their own twisted form of entertainment. The clash, when it came, shook the foundations of reality itself. Guardian defenders advanced through boulevards where the architecture itself had been warped by centuries of dark ritual, their shuriken catapults singing as they cut down cultists who fought with the fury of the damned. Behind them came the dire avengers, their blue armor gleaming like stars against the shadows as they systematically cleared each district of corruption. In the Plaza of Endless Torments, Farseer Thirianna faced Prince Vecht himself in single combat. The future Dark Eldar Lord fought with weapons that dripped with the essence of suffering, each blow designed not merely to kill, but to inflict maximum agony. Yet Thirianna moved like flowing water, her blade weaving patterns that spoke of discipline rather than cruelty, purpose rather than pleasure. "You would chain our people to your narrow paths," Vecht snarled, as their weapons met in showers of sparks. "We who have known the full spectrum of sensation, reduced to following predetermined roads like mindless automatons." Thirianna's response came not in words, but in the graceful strike that severed his weapon arm. "Freedom without wisdom is merely another form of slavery," she replied as he fell. "We offer liberation from the tyranny of appetite." As the battle raged through Commorragh's districts, a transformation was already beginning in the cleansed territories. Spirit seers and farseers worked together to establish the first path shrines, places where Eldar could channel their intense nature into focused disciplines. The path of the warrior, the path of the seer, the path of service, each offering structure where chaos had reigned. Ranger Illic Nightspear, one of the first to embrace the new way, knelt before the shrine dedicated to the outcast path. The ceremony was simple yet profound, a choice to wander the galaxy, not in search of sensation, but in service to his people's survival. As he rose, his spirit felt lighter, despite the weight of responsibility he now carried. Yet victory in Commorragh came at a terrible price. Thousands of Eldar who could not be saved chose death over the abandonment of their corrupted ways. Others fled deeper into the webway's forgotten realms, carrying their taint with them into the spaces between spaces. These exiles would nurse their resentment in the dark corners of reality, and though they did not yet know it, they had taken the first steps toward becoming something new and terrible. The Drukhari. Prince Vect himself, broken but not destroyed, gathered the remnants of his forces for a final retreat. As his surviving Kabalites and witches vanished into the webway's deepest reaches, he cast one last look at the city he had ruled. "This is not ending," he whispered, his voice carrying through dimensions to reach Eldrad's ears. "This is transformation. You may have won Comora, but you have also given birth to something you will rue for all eternity." The Farseer's response was heavy with the weight of prophecy. "I know, but the alternative was the death of everything we are. Some prices must be paid." As the great port city began its cleansing under the guidance of the Pathbuilders, the first phase of the civil war drew to a close. The pleasure cults had been scattered, their strongholds purified or abandoned. Yet the corruption had not been destroyed, merely driven into the shadows where it would fester and adapt. In hidden enclaves throughout the webway, the exiled Eldar began to embrace new forms of depravity. Where their ancestors had pursued pleasure, they would pursue pain. Where the old cults had celebrated excess, the new Drukhari would worship cruelty itself. The Shadow War had begun, and it would continue for millennia to come. But for now, in the spaces reclaimed by the Reformers, hope flickered like a candle in the cosmic dark. The paths were being established, offering structure and purpose to a people who had nearly lost themselves in the pursuit of ultimate sensation. Eldar children would grow up learning discipline rather than indulgence, wisdom rather than excess. The great purification was complete, but the true work of rebuilding their civilization was only just beginning, and in the deepest reaches of the warp, something vast and hungry stirred, sensing that its moment of birth had been postponed, but not prevented. The Eldar had bought themselves time, but time was all they had won. The future remained balanced on a knife's edge, and the choices they made in the days to come would determine whether their people would rise to new heights or fall into an even deeper darkness than the one they had just escaped. Chapter 3. Architects of Tomorrow. In the aftermath of the Great Purification, the Eldar Empire stood like a phoenix emerging from ashes, scarred but unbroken, diminished yet somehow more focused than it had been in millennia. The cleansed territories of Comora hummed with new purpose as Farseers and Spirit Seers worked to forge institutions that would guard against the corruption that had nearly consumed them all. Yet this was not merely reconstruction, but transformation, the birth of a civilization that would learn wisdom from the edge of its own destruction. The Council of Renewal convened in the restored chamber of echoing wisdom, where the greatest minds of the surviving craft worlds gathered to reshape the very foundations of Eldar governance. No longer would power rest in the hands of hereditary nobles, whose appetites had grown monstrous with age. Instead, a new structure emerged, one where authority flowed through merit, wisdom, and dedication to the paths that now defined their people's spiritual journey. Farseer Eldrad stood before the assembled council, his ancient eyes reflecting the weight of futures glimpsed and choices made. Around the great table sat representatives from every loyal craft world, their combined wisdom forming a tapestry of experience that spanned the galaxy. Yet for all their knowledge, they faced questions that had never before demanded answers. "We have purged the corruption," spoke Spirit Seer Ayanna of Ayandan, her voice carrying the authority of one who had communed with the spirits of the dead. "But purification alone creates only emptiness. We must fill that void with purpose, or risk the darkness returning in new forms." The first great work was the establishment of the Path Council, a governing body where each of the emerging paths would have voice and representation. No longer would warriors alone hold sway in times of conflict, or seers dominate in periods of contemplation. The path of the artisan would stand equal to the path of the warrior, the path of service beside the path of the seer. Balance, not dominance, would guide their people forward. Autarch Millennial of Saimhan, her crimson armor bearing the scars of the recent civil war, spoke of the military implications. The old ways made us mighty, but they also made us vulnerable. Our warrior nobility fought for glory and sensation. Our new aspect warriors must fight for protection and purpose. As the council deliberated, deep within the webway's restored passages, a different kind of renaissance was taking shape. Bonesinger Iriel of Ulthwe worked alongside the greatest technomancers of their age, weaving new safeguards into the interdimensional tunnels that connected their scattered domains. The ancient network, built in the dawn of their civilization, had become a highway for corruption. Now it would become a fortress. The webway gates themselves were rebuilt with psychic resonance chambers that could detect the taint of excess before it spread. Where once the passages had been open, roads for any Eldar to traverse, now they would be guarded by automated systems that read the spiritual purity of travelers. Those who carried the seeds of corruption would find the gates sealed against them, forcing the darkness to remain isolated in the forgotten corners where it now festered. Yet the greatest work was the expansion of the Infinity Circuit network. On every cleansed world, new Wraithbone matrices were grown, living architecture that would serve as both home and sanctuary for the Eldar soul. These circuits did not merely preserve the consciousness of the dead, but actively guided the living toward wisdom. The whispers of ancestors would counsel those who walked the paths, sharing millennia of accumulated knowledge to prevent the errors that had nearly doomed their race. Farseer Kalin of Alatok stood in the first of the new circuit chambers, her hand resting on walls that pulsed with gentle light. The voices of the departed spoke not of past glories or faded pleasures, but of duty and sacrifice, wisdom and restraint. Here, the young would come to learn not just the skills of their chosen path, but the spiritual discipline that would keep them from straying into excess. "The dead shall guide the living," she whispered, feeling the approval of countless generations flowing through the Wraithbone. "Never again will we walk blind into darkness." As the internal transformation continued, the Eldar began to look outward, with eyes made clear by their recent trials. For the first time in eons, they truly saw the galaxy around them, not as a playground for their amusement, but as a vast theater where other races struggled with their own forms of darkness and light. The protocols of first contact emerged from lengthy debate among the Path Council. Where once the Eldar had regarded lesser species as curiosities at best and annoyances at worst, now they recognized the need for careful engagement. The young races that emerged across the galaxy might one day face their own moments of choosing, and the wisdom gained from the Eldar's near fall could serve as guidance. Ranger Aradrian, one of the first to walk the renewed outcast path, stood before a council of his peers and spoke of his observations. The Mon-Ke humans endure their own trials in the darkness between stars. Their empires rise and fall like waves upon a shore. Yet in their struggle, I see echoes of our own journey. The same hunger for knowledge, the same capacity for both creation and destruction. The protocols that emerged were cautious, but not isolationist. Contact would be made only when necessity demanded it. Guidance offered only to those who proved capable of wisdom. The Eldar would not impose their will upon the galaxy, but neither would they abandon it to the forces of entropy that even now stirred in the warp's depths. In the forges of Biel-Tan, new aspect warrior shrines took shape under the guidance of Phoenix Lord Asaman himself. The dire Avengers had always embodied noble warfare, but now their teachings expanded beyond personal excellence to encompass protection of the innocent and preservation of what was worth saving. Where once they had fought for glory, now they would fight for guardianship. The Shrine of the Shielding Dawn became the first of these new temples, its halls echoing with the footsteps of warriors who learned to see defense not as a passive stance, but as the highest form of courage. These aspect warriors would carry weapons designed not merely to kill enemies, but to protect allies, force shields that could deflect artillery, weapons that could stun rather than slaughter. Exarch Fuegan stood before the first graduating class of these new warriors, his ancient armor gleaming with flames that burned but did not consume. "You are not weapons of conquest," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of millennia. "You are guardians of hope. Let your enemies fear you not for your cruelty, but for your unwavering dedication to what you defend." As the Reformation deepened, the Eldar found themselves becoming something they had never been before. A people defined not by their superiority over others, but by their responsibility to themselves and to the future they were building. The paths provided structure without stagnation, purpose without obsession. Young Eldar, who might once have spent centuries pursuing ever more exotic pleasures, now dedicated themselves to mastering disciplines that served the greater good. Yet even as hope flourished in the cleansed territories, shadows lingered in the spaces between. In the dark corners of the webway, Prince Vector's forces adapted to their exile with cunning that spoke of intelligence unclouded by the Reformation's light. They would not remain hidden forever, and when they emerged, it would be with purposes that made their former corruption seem tame by comparison. The work of rebuilding was far from complete. Each day brought new challenges, as the Eldar learned to balance individual excellence with collective responsibility, personal growth with social stability. The paths offered guidance, but they could not guarantee that every soul would choose wisely when faced with temptation. Still, for the first time in millennia, the future held promise rather than merely possibility. The Eldar Empire had looked into the abyss of its own making and chosen to turn away. Now it would spend the ages to come proving that such a choice could endure. The architects of tomorrow worked with tools of spirit and discipline, building not monuments to their own glory, but foundations for a civilization that might yet teach the galaxy the difference between power and wisdom. Whether they would succeed remained to be written in the stars themselves, but the work had begun, and with it, hope flickered like a flame that refused to be extinguished. In the depths of the warp, something vast and hungry stirred with frustration, its moment of birth still postponed by the choices of a people who had learned to choose differently. The future remained unwritten, balanced between the light of hard-won wisdom and the ever-present shadow of what they had almost become. Chapter 4. The Human Question. The first sign that the galaxy had changed came not through far-seer vision or webway scout, but through the sudden silence where once the warp had screamed with unending torment. For 5 millennia, the psychic storms that had isolated the scattered worlds of humanity had raged like a cosmic hurricane. Fed by the very corruption the Eldar had now purged from their souls. As the Reformation took hold, and the birth scream of She Who Thirsts faded to nothing more than an echo of possibility, the storms began to calm. Ranger Illic Nightspear crouched in the ruins of what had once been a human colony on the world of Mordian, his enhanced senses reading the traces of recent activity. The settlement had been abandoned for centuries, its people fled or dead during the worst of the Age of Strife. Yet now fresh footprints marked the dust, and the distant hum of primitive engines spoke of a people emerging from their long isolation. "They move with purpose," he reported through the webway communication link to the Council of Renewal. "Not the desperate scavenging of survivors, but the methodical expansion of a race that has remembered how to dream of stars." The implications struck the Eldar leadership like a thunderbolt. For millennia, they had been the unquestioned masters of the galaxy, their only true rivals the sleeping Necrons and the distant Orc empires. The younger races had been curiosities, brief candles that flickered and died, while the Eldar pursued their eternal games of sensation and power. Now, freed from the corruption that had nearly consumed them, they found themselves facing a galaxy where they were no longer alone. Farseer Eldrad stood in the Chamber of Infinite Sight, his ancient consciousness reaching out through the warp to touch the edges of this new presence. What he found there made him recoil, not in fear, but in recognition. The psychic signature that blazed from the third planet of the Sol system was vast and purposeful. A mind that had gazed into the same abyss that had nearly claimed the Eldar, and emerged with its own form of terrible resolve. "There is power there," he whispered to the assembled council. "A single will that seeks to bind humanity together, as we have bound ourselves to the paths. But where we chose discipline through wisdom, this mind chooses unity through conquest." The first direct contact came 60 days later, in the void between stars, where an Eldar patrol fleet encountered vessels bearing the twin-headed eagle of a reborn human empire. The Imperial ships were primitive by Eldar standards, their hulls scarred by warp travel that relied on brute force rather than elegant navigation. Yet they moved with the confidence of a people who had reclaimed their birthright among the stars. Captain Arena of the craft world Mai Mayara held her sleek vessel steady as the human flagship approached, its gun ports sealed but ready. The diplomatic protocols established by the Council of Renewal had prepared for this moment, but theory and practice were vastly different things when facing an unknown quantity with the power to reshape the galaxy. The communication that crackled across the void came not in the crude binary codes the Eldar expected, but in perfect high Gothic, infused with psychic harmonics that spoke of a mind accustomed to operating on multiple levels of reality. "I am the Emperor of mankind." The voice resonated with authority that made even the Eldar bridge crew straighten involuntarily. "I would speak with those who have watched humanity's trials from afar." The meeting took place on a neutral asteroid, its barren surface chosen to prevent either side from claiming advantage. The Emperor came not with an army, but with a small retinue that included figures the Eldar censors could barely comprehend, warriors whose genetic patterns had been rewritten at the fundamental level, minds that burned with engineered purpose. Farseer Eldrad materialized from the webway portal with his own escort of dire avengers, their blue armor gleaming under the asteroid's artificial lights. The two leaders faced each other across a distance, measured not in meters, but in the vast gulf between species that had taken different paths through the darkness. "Your people have changed," the Emperor observed, his golden eyes studying the Eldar delegation with the intensity of one accustomed to seeing through masks and pretense. "The corruption that once stained your souls has been cleansed, an impressive feat for a race that seemed destined to birth its own destroyer." Eldrad's response carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "We looked into the abyss and chose to step back rather than fall. Your own people face similar trials. The question is whether you will learn from our near downfall or repeat it in your own fashion." The Emperor's silence stretched long enough for both leaders to take the measure of the other. Here stood two beings who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, who understood the price of survival in a galaxy where the slightest weakness could mean extinction. Yet their solutions to the fundamental problem of sentient existence could not have been more different. "I offer unity through purpose," the Emperor said at last. "Humanity will be bound together, not by pleasure or individual will, but by shared destiny and mutual protection. We have learned that division leads only to darkness." "And we offer structure through choice," Eldrad replied. "The paths provide guidance without compulsion, wisdom without tyranny. Perhaps there is room in this galaxy for both approaches." The negotiations that followed lasted for weeks, conducted in chambers where the greatest minds of both species sought to map a future that would not end in mutual destruction. The Eldar spoke of their observations of human colonies, their insights into the warp dangers that threatened psychers, their knowledge of ancient threats that stirred in the galaxy's depths. The Emperor shared his vision of unified humanity, his plans for expansion that would bring scattered human worlds back into contact with their lost heritage. Yet it was the glimpse Eldrad caught of the Emperor's most closely guarded secret that truly revealed the scope of the challenge they faced. In a moment of unguarded thought, the Farseer's consciousness touched the edge of something vast and ambitious, a project that sought to create not just enhanced humans, but beings who would serve as living symbols of humanity's potential. The Primarch project blazed in Eldrad's mind like 20 stars of engineered perfection, each one designed to embody a different aspect of human excellence. He saw genetic templates that rivaled even the Eldar's mastery of biological form, minds crafted to lead and inspire, souls strong enough to resist the corruption that had nearly claimed his own people. "Ambitious," Eldrad murmured as the vision faded, "but dangerous. Such perfection often carries within it the seeds of its own corruption." The Emperor's gaze sharpened. "You have seen them. Tell me, Farseer, in your visions of potential futures, do my sons succeed or fail?" Eldred's answer came weighted with the burden of prophecy. "I see paths that lead to glory and paths that lead to damnation. The choice, as always, will be theirs to make. But know this, power without wisdom is merely another form of slavery, and even the most perfect creation can fall if it forgets the purpose for which it was made." The first formal treaty between the reformed Eldar Empire and the nascent Imperium of Man was signed in the shadow of these warnings. Trade agreements were established for the exchange of knowledge and resources. Mutual defense pacts were negotiated to address threats that neither species could face alone. Boundaries were drawn that would prevent expansion conflicts while allowing both civilizations to grow. Yet even as the documents were sealed with psychic bindings that would ensure their honoring, both leaders knew they were setting in motion forces that would reshape the galaxy. The Eldar brought wisdom earned through near catastrophe, but they also brought caution that might slow necessary action. Humanity brought unity and purpose, but they also brought ambition that might repeat the mistakes of older species. Back on Ulthwé, the Council of Renewal debated the implications of what they had witnessed. Some argued for deeper cooperation, seeing in humanity the energy and adaptability that the Eldar had lost through ages of careful discipline. Others warned that contact with such an aggressively expanding race might contaminate the paths they had worked so hard to establish. "They are what we once were," argued Farseer Kalen. "Proud, powerful, convinced of their own righteousness. They may learn wisdom as we have, but the price of that lesson could be the galaxy itself." "Or," countered Spirit Seer Ayana, "they may succeed where we failed. Their unity has strength our individualism lacks. Perhaps together we can forge something greater than either species could achieve alone." The debate would continue for decades as the Great Crusade unfolded across the stars, bringing scattered human worlds back into the Imperial fold with a combination of diplomacy and force that the Eldar watched with fascination and growing concern. Each victory brought humanity closer to the stature their ancestors had once held, but it also brought them closer to the temptations that had nearly destroyed far greater civilizations. In the depths of space, the first joint Eldar-human exploratory fleet set course for the galaxy's edge, carrying representatives of both species into the unknown. It was a symbol of cooperation, but it was also a test. Would these two proud races learn to work together, or would their fundamental differences eventually drive them to war? The Emperor's Primarchs grew toward maturity in their secret laboratories, each one a masterwork of genetic engineering and psychic conditioning. The Eldar Farseers watched their development through the webway's hidden passages, seeking signs of corruption or instability. What they found was both reassuring and troubling, minds of incredible capability shaped by purpose so strong it bordered on obsession. The future balanced on the edge of possibilities too vast to comprehend fully. Two species that had survived their respective darknesses now faced the challenge of surviving each other. Whether that survival would take the form of cooperation or competition remained to be written in the stars themselves. Yet for the first time in millennia, the galaxy held the promise of something other than endless decline toward entropy. The Eldar had chosen wisdom over indulgence. Humanity was choosing unity over division. Between them, they might forge a future that neither could achieve alone, or they might discover that the universe was too small to contain both their ambitions. The human question had been asked. Now came the far more difficult task of finding an answer that would not drown the galaxy in blood. Chapter 5. The Orc Menace. The first warnings came from the edge of known space, where Eldar scouts monitoring the galaxy's rim detected psychic emanations that made even the most disciplined rangers retreat in horror. It was not the corruption they had fought within their own borders, but something far older and more primal, the collective roar of a species that knew only war, and found in conflict the purest expression of joy. War boss Grimdark had united the scattered orc clans of the Grendel Stars under a single brutal banner, his massive frame standing as a monument to the principle that might made right. The war that followed in his wake consumed systems like a green tide of destruction, turning once peaceful worlds into battlegrounds where the only law was the survival of the strongest. Yet this was not mere random violence, but war with purpose. Grimskull's crude but effective mind had grasped that the galaxy was changing, and he intended to claim his share of the spoils. The orcish fleet that emerged from the galactic edge numbered in the thousands, ramshackle vessels held together by faith in their own invincibility and powered by engines that should have been impossible according to any rational understanding of physics. Behind them came the rock ships, hollowed-out asteroids packed with millions of green-skin warriors who saw the approaching campaign not as conquest, but as the greatest entertainment the universe could provide. Farseer Eldrad stood in the War Council chamber aboard Ulthwé, his ancient features grim as he studied the tactical displays that showed the enemy's inexorable advance. Around the table sat representatives from every major craft world, their combined wisdom focused on a threat unlike any they had faced since the War in Heaven. They moved toward the Cadia system, reported Autarch Iriel of Iandan, his scarred armor bearing testament to previous encounters with green-skin raiders. If they establish a foothold there, they will control the passage between human and Eldar space. Both our civilizations will be isolated, forced to face them separately. The implications struck the assembled leaders like a physical blow. The Cadian system sat at a crucial nexus point, where webway gates connected to human warp routes, making it one of the few places where rapid communication between the two empires was possible. In Orc hands, it would become a fortress from which they could raid both species at will. The message that reached Terra 3 days later carried the weight of desperation carefully concealed beneath diplomatic formality. For the first time, the Eldar were asking for human aid, not as a gesture of cooperation, but as a necessity for mutual survival. The Emperor's response came with a swiftness that spoke of his own recognition of the threat. The Joint War Council that convened on the world of Mordian brought together minds that had never before worked in true partnership. Imperial generals studied tactical displays alongside Eldar autarchs, while Space Marine captains compared strategies with aspect warrior exarchs. The differences in approach were immediately apparent. Where the humans favored direct assault and overwhelming force, the Eldar preferred precision strikes and maneuver warfare. Captain Dawn of the Imperial Fists stood rigidly at attention as he addressed the mixed assembly, his yellow armor gleaming under the chamber's artificial lights. The Primarch's presence lent weight to the Imperial commitment, his tactical genius already legendary among the expanding legions. "The enemy's strength lies in numbers and momentum," Dawn declared, his voice carrying the certainty of one accustomed to victory. "We must force them to fight on our terms, in positions where their advantages become weaknesses." Autarch Theron of Mymeara studied the Imperial officer with eyes that had witnessed millennia of warfare. "Your assessment is correct, but incomplete. Orcs are not merely numerous, they are psychically empowered by their own belief in victory. The more successful they become, the stronger they grow. We must shatter their confidence before we can shatter their armies." The plan that emerged from weeks of careful negotiation was unlike anything either species had attempted before. Imperial forces would serve as the anvil, establishing strong defensive positions that would draw the Orc advance into predetermined killing grounds. Eldar forces would become the hammer, striking with surgical precision at command structures and support elements that kept the green tide flowing. The test of this new alliance came at the Battle of Goro Prime, where Grimskull's advance guard sought to establish a forward base in preparation for the assault on Cadia. The world itself was unremarkable, a barren rock with minimal strategic value, save for its position along the invasion route. Yet it became the ground where two philosophies of war would either merge into something greater or shatter against each other's limitations. Brother Captain Sigismund of the Imperial Fists took his position in the primary defense line, his black sword gleaming as he prepared his warriors for the storm that was coming. Around him, Space Marines in yellow armor checked their weapons with the methodical precision that had made their legion famous. Yet today, they would not fight alone. From the webway gates that flickered to life behind the Imperial positions came warriors whose grace and skill were legend throughout the galaxy. Dire avengers in blue armor took positions alongside the Marines, their shuriken catapults singing with eagerness for battle. Striking scorpions melted into the shadows between defensive positions, preparing to emerge where the enemy least expected them. Exarch Karandras of the Striking Scorpions approached Sigismund with footsteps that made no sound despite his heavy armor. The Marine captain turned to face the Eldar warrior, noting how the Xenos moved with a fluidity that seemed to defy the laws of physics. "Your defenses are strong," Karandras observed, his voice carrying the whisper of death itself. "But static positions will not be enough. Orcs learn from pain, and if they break through even once, they will adapt their next assault accordingly." Sigismund's response carried the weight of Imperial doctrine. "Then we must ensure they do not break through at all. The Emperor's will is that this line holds, and so it shall. The Eldar warrior's laugh was like wind through a graveyard. Admirable, but incomplete. Watch and learn, Monkey. Sometimes the strongest defense is knowing when to bend. The Orc assault, when it came, was everything the defenders had expected, and worse. Thousands of greenskins charged across the barren plains of Goro Prime, their crude weapons blazing as they sought to overwhelm the Allied line through sheer ferocity. Massive war engines rumbled forward behind them, cobbled together tanks and walkers that should have collapsed under their own weight, but remained functional through the inexplicable power of Orc belief. The Imperial guns opened fire first, Bolter and Lescanon creating zones of death that carved bloody furrows through the advancing horde. Yet for every Orc that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place, their battle lust growing stronger with each casualty they witnessed. It was then that the Eldar revealed the true nature of coordinated warfare. While the Imperial forces maintained their defensive fire, aspect warriors began to move with purpose that seemed choreographed by an intelligence beyond individual decision-making. Fire dragons emerged from concealed positions to target the enemy war engines, their fusion guns turning armor into molten slag. Hawks swooping from above struck at command groups, their laser lancers picking off knobs and big mechs with surgical precision. Brother Captain Sigismund watched in fascination as the Eldar warriors flowed around and through the Imperial positions, like water finding its level. Where Space Marines stood firm against the green tide, Eldar struck and faded, appearing wherever the enemy was strongest, only to vanish again before retaliation could be organized. They fight like dancers, he voxed to his second-in-command, every movement planned, every strike placed with perfect timing. The revelation came when a massive Orc stomper broke through the defensive line, its crude but effective weapons sweeping aside Marines and Guardians alike. For a moment, it seemed the combined defense would collapse under the weight of the war machine's assault. Then Sigismund saw coordination elevated to art. Dire Avengers focused their fire on the Stomper's legs, while fire dragons moved to attack its rear armor. Dark Reapers on the ridgeline behind targeted its weapon systems with precision that bordered on prescience. Yet it was the Imperial response that truly demonstrated the potential of their alliance. Sigismund's company advanced not in the rigid formation that doctrine demanded, but in fluid groups that complemented the Eldar assault. Where aspect warriors created openings, Space Marines exploited them. Where Imperial firepower suppressed enemy movement, Eldar precision strikes eliminated key targets. The Stomper fell not to any single decisive blow, but to 100 perfectly coordinated attacks that stripped away its defenses layer by layer until nothing remained but scrap metal and disappointed green-skinned spirits. The victory at Goro Prime sent shockwaves through both the Orc advance and the Allied leadership. In a single engagement, they had demonstrated that cooperation between their forces was not merely possible, but potentially devastating against any enemy that faced them. The Orc advance, deprived of its expected easy victory, began to falter as Grimskull's subordinates questioned whether the war was as unstoppable as their leader claimed. Yet the true revolution began in the aftermath, as Imperial and Eldar commanders met to analyze what they had accomplished. The tactical recordings showed moments of coordination that neither species could have achieved alone. Imperial steadiness combined with Eldar precision, human determination merged with alien wisdom. Techmarine Call of the Imperial Fists found himself in lengthy discussions with Bonesinger Iriel about the fundamental differences between Imperial and Eldar technology. Where human equipment was built for durability and ease of mass production, Eldar creations emphasized elegance and psychic resonance. Yet both approaches had merits that the other lacked. "Your weapons are crude but reliable," Iriel observed, as he examined a bolter with the eye of a craftsman. "They will function even when maintained by untrained hands. Our shuriken catapults require constant attunement, but their rate of fire is unmatched when properly calibrated." The technology exchange programs that emerged from these discussions would reshape both civilizations in ways neither fully anticipated. Imperial forces began to incorporate Eldar techniques for psychic resonance into their equipment, while Eldar workshops studied human mass production methods that could be adapted to their own needs without sacrificing quality. More importantly, the shared victory had created bonds of trust that transcended the suspicions both species harbored about alien cooperation. Space Marines who had fought alongside dire Avengers spoke of their Xenos allies with respect born of shared bloodshed. Eldar warriors who had witnessed Imperial determination in the face of overwhelming odds began to see beyond their traditional view of humans as crude but amusing children. The Orc War continued to threaten both empires, but now it faced not two separate civilizations fighting parallel campaigns, but a true alliance capable of coordinated response. Grimskull's crude, strategic mind began to grasp that the galaxy had changed in ways his simple philosophy of might makes right could not comprehend. Yet even as the alliance strengthened through shared warfare, shadows moved in the spaces between reality. The corruption that had been driven from Eldar space had not been destroyed, merely forced to adapt. Prince Vekt's exiled forces watched the growing cooperation between the species with cold calculation, seeking ways to exploit this new development for their own dark purposes. The victory at Goro Prime had proven that Eldar and humans could fight as one. Whether they could survive the consequences of that success remained to be written in blood and starlight across the galaxy's contested systems. Chapter 6. Lords of the Webway. The first human to truly comprehend the magnitude of what the Eldar had achieved was not a general or an admiral, but a scholar whose mind burned with the same hunger for knowledge that had once driven his species to the stars. Magnus the Red stood at the threshold of a webway gate on the world of Prospero, his crimson armor gleaming as psychic energies crackled around his towering form. The Primarch of the Thousand Suns had requested this demonstration not as a military leader seeking tactical advantage, but as a seeker of truth confronting the ultimate mystery. Farseer Eldrad materialized from the shimmering portal with the fluid grace that marked all Eldar movement through their ancient network. Behind him came a small retinue of warlocks, their minds linked in perfect harmony as they maintained the dimensional gateway that made this meeting possible. For the first time in 10,000 years, a Primarch stood in the presence of Eldar masters, and both sides felt the weight of possibilities that stretched beyond the horizon of mortal understanding. "It is not mere transportation," Magnus observed, his psychic senses probing the edges of the dimensional rift. "The webway exists in a state between the material realm and the warp, but separate from both. How is this possible?" Eldrad's ancient features showed the faintest trace of approval. Few beings in the galaxy possessed the mental acuity to grasp even the basic principles of webway construction. Yet this red-skinned giant had identified its fundamental nature within moments of exposure. "Your father seeks to replicate what we have built," the Farseer replied, his words carrying the weight of prophecy. "The Golden Throne on Terra shows evidence of similar dimensional manipulation, though his approach is crude compared to what our ancestors achieved." The revelation that the Emperor's most secret project was known to the Eldar sent ripples of shock through the Imperial delegation. Magnus himself felt the stirring of recognition. His father's mysterious work beneath the imperial palace had always been shrouded in the deepest secrecy, yet here was proof that their alien allies understood its purpose better than most of the Emperor's own sons. The negotiations that followed took place in chambers where reality itself seemed negotiable. Eldar bone singers had grown the meeting space from living wraithbone, creating architecture that responded to the emotional resonance of its occupants. When discussions grew heated, the walls themselves seemed to pulse with tension. When understanding was reached, soft harmonies echoed through corridors that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Tech-adept Call of the Imperial expedition found himself struggling to comprehend instruments that functioned according to principles his most advanced training had never contemplated. Where Imperial technology relied on mechanical precision and brute force application of energy, Eldar devices seemed to operate through harmony between user and machine, thought made manifest through psychic resonance. "Your approach is fascinating," he admitted to Bone Singer Iriel, as they examined a webway node that maintained dimensional stability through what appeared to be pure willpower. "But how do you achieve consistent results without standardized components?" The Eldar craftsman's laugh carried notes like crystal chimes. "You assume that consistency requires uniformity. Each webway gate is unique, grown rather than built, shaped by the consciousness of its creator. Yet all serve the same purpose, because purpose shapes form, not the reverse." The Emperor's arrival, 3 weeks into the negotiations, transformed the nature of the discussions entirely. The Master of Mankind did not come with fleets or armies, but alone, his presence so overwhelming that even the Eldar delegation felt compelled to acknowledge the sheer force of will that radiated from his golden form. Eldrad met him in the Chamber of Infinite Mirrors, where past and future reflected endlessly through crystalline surfaces that showed not images, but possibilities. The two beings who faced each other across that space represented fundamentally different approaches to the problem of existence, one seeking to impose order through unified will, the other pursuing harmony through disciplined diversity. "You offer to teach us your secrets," the Emperor said, his voice resonating with harmonics that made the chamber's walls sing in response. "Yet I sense this gift comes with conditions that may prove more costly than the knowledge itself." Eldrad's response carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. Knowledge without wisdom is merely another form of weapon. We have seen what happens when transcendent power is pursued without understanding its true cost. Your webway project will succeed or fail not based on the sophistication of its construction, but on the wisdom of its use. The conditions the Eldar proposed were unlike any treaty the nascent Imperium had ever considered. Access to webway construction techniques would be granted, but only to those who could demonstrate mastery of the discipline required to use them responsibly. Imperial psychers would be trained in Eldar meditation techniques not to make them more powerful, but to teach them the restraint necessary to avoid the corruption that had nearly destroyed the galaxy's eldest race. Most crucially, the Emperor would be required to submit his own webway designs for Eldar review before implementation. The proud ruler of humanity, who had never bowed to any authority save necessity itself, found himself confronting allies who demanded oversight of his most precious project. "You ask me to share power over humanity's future with those who are not human," the Emperor observed, his tone carefully neutral. "We ask you to learn from those who have already paid the price of hubris," Eldrad replied. "Your Primarch Magnus understands the principle. Power shared is power strengthened, not diminished." Magnus the Red had indeed found understanding in his communion with the Eldar Farseers. The sessions that took place in the depths of Prospero's libraries revealed to him psychic techniques that his Legion's scholars had never imagined. Where the Thousand Suns had pursued knowledge as conquest, gathering ever more esoteric lore like trophies of intellectual victory, the Eldar approached the same mysteries as gardeners, tending a growth that required patience and wisdom. Ahriman, chief librarian of the Thousand Suns, found himself studying alongside Warlock Eldorath in exercises that challenged every assumption he had held about the nature of psychic power. Where he had been taught to grasp and control the warp's energies through force of will, the Eldar showed him techniques that worked through harmony and cooperation with forces far greater than individual consciousness. "Your methods are more powerful than ours," Ahriman admitted, as he successfully performed his first true webway manipulation, opening a gateway that remained stable without constant mental effort. Yet they require a humility that our Legion has never cultivated. Eldorath's response came with the gentle authority of one who had witnessed both triumph and catastrophe. "Humility is not weakness, Mon Kay. It is the recognition that some forces are too vast to be conquered and must instead be partnered with. Your Primarch grasps this truth. It is why he alone among your father's sons shows true potential for webway mastery." The joint research facilities that emerged from these negotiations represented a revolution in both civilizations' approach to scientific advancement. On the world of Mordian III, Eldar Bonesingers worked alongside Imperial tech adepts to create hybrid technologies that combined human durability with alien elegance. The first successful projects were communication arrays that could maintain contact across galactic distances without relying on astropathic transmission, and defensive systems that drew power from the webway itself rather than conventional energy sources. Yet the true marvel was the prototype gates that began to connect Imperial and Eldar territories through passages that existed outside normal space-time. A space marine could step through a portal on Terra and emerge moments later in the depths of Komorrah, while Eldar diplomats could attend council sessions in the Imperial Palace without enduring the dangers of conventional warp travel. The strategic implications were staggering. With webway access, the Great Crusade could expand at a pace that would have been impossible through conventional means. Fleets that would have taken months to reach distant battlefronts could deploy in hours. Supply lines that stretched across impossible distances could be maintained as easily as communications between neighboring star systems. Yet with opportunity came temptation, and the Emperor's enthusiasm for the new possibilities began to concern even his closest allies. The vision that consumed him was magnificent in scope, a human empire that spanned the galaxy, connected by webway passages that would eliminate the dangers of warp travel forever. Humanity would be freed from dependence on navigators, liberated from the risks that made every interstellar journey a gamble with forces beyond mortal comprehension. "Your father sees the webway as a tool for expansion," Magnus confided to his brother Fulgrim during one of their rare meetings. "But I begin to understand that it is something far more significant, a test of whether a species is ready to transcend its physical limitations without losing its essential nature." The Primarch of the Emperor's children studied his crimson-armored brother with eyes that reflected their own hunger for perfection. "And do you believe we are ready for such a test?" Magnus's response carried the weight of knowledge gained through communion with minds that had survived their own near destruction. "I believe we must be ready, whether we are prepared or not. The choice is no longer ours to make. The universe itself is changing, and we must change with it, or be swept aside by forces we cannot hope to resist." The first successful long-distance webway journey undertaken by Imperial forces took place 6 months after the initial agreements were signed. A full company of Ultramarines, led by Captain Gilliman, travelled from Terra to the eastern fringe in what should have been a voyage of several standard years. They emerged from the webway gates after a journey that had lasted less than a Terran day, their blue armour unmarked by the passage, and their spirits lifted by the experience of travelling through dimensions where time itself seemed to flow differently. The success of the venture sent shockwaves through both civilizations. Imperial commanders began to plan campaigns that would have been logistically impossible under the old system, while Eldar farseers watched the rapid expansion of human influence with growing concern. "They adapt quickly," observed Farseer Kalin, as she monitored the increasing Imperial use of webway passages. "Perhaps too quickly for their own good. We spent millennia learning to use these paths responsibly. They seek to master them in decades." Yet even as concerns mounted about the pace of change, the benefits of cooperation continued to manifest. Joint expeditions discovered new passages that had been sealed since the War in Heaven, opening routes that could shave centuries off journeys to the galaxy's most distant regions. Combined research teams developed safeguards that protected both species from the corruption that still festered in the webway's forgotten corners. Most importantly, the success of the technology sharing program created bonds of trust that transcended the mutual wariness both civilizations had harbored. When Imperial forces encountered problems in their webway construction, they turned to Eldar advisors rather than attempting to solve them through brute force. When Eldar expeditions faced threats too large for their usual tactics, they requested Imperial support without shame or hesitation. The future seemed to hold infinite possibility, connected by passages that existed outside the normal flow of space and time. Two civilizations that had once viewed each other with suspicion now worked toward goals that neither could achieve alone. The galaxy itself seemed smaller, more manageable, filled with wonders that cooperative exploration might unlock. Yet in the deepest reaches of the webway, where Prince Vect's forces had established their exile kingdoms, darker plans were taking shape. The cooperation between Eldar and human offered new opportunities for corruption, and those who had embraced the shadow were learning to exploit the very connections that their former kin believed would secure the future. The lords of the webway had shared their greatest secret with humanity. Whether that sharing would prove to be salvation or catastrophe remained to be written in the spaces between dimensions, where possibility and reality danced their eternal ballet of creation and destruction. Chapter 7. The Chaos Revelation. The investigation began as a routine examination of warp disturbances detected by the joint monitoring stations that now linked Eldar and human space. Magnus the Red stood in the center of the psychic resonance chamber aboard Prospero, his towering form surrounded by runic circles that pulsed with contained power. Around him, Eldar farseers maintained their positions in a pattern that had taken weeks to perfect, their combined consciousness reaching into the Imperium with a precision that neither species could have achieved alone. What they found in the depths of unreality shattered every assumption both civilizations had held about the nature of existence itself. "There are presences here," Magnus whispered, his psychic voice carrying across dimensions to touch the minds of his alien allies. Ancient beyond measure, yet somehow incomplete, as if they exist in a state between potential and manifestation. Farseer Eldrad's response came heavy with the weight of terrible understanding. "Not incomplete, Lord Magnus," interrupted. "These are the dark powers that feed on the emotions of sentient beings, grown fat on the suffering and excess of countless species across the aeons. Yet one among them remains unborn, its birth scream silenced by choices we made in the darkness of our greatest trial. The vision that unfolded in the chamber's psychic matrix was more terrible than any nightmare the assembled minds had ever experienced. They saw the warp not as the chaotic realm of energy that human psyches had always known, but as a reflection of consciousness itself, a dimension where thought became reality and emotion took on physical form. Within its roiling depths, vast intelligences stirred, entities of such power and malevolence that their very existence threatened the sanity of those who perceived them. Khorne, the blood god, raging eternal in his brass citadel, built from the skulls of warriors who had died in countless battles across the galaxy. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, weaving plots within plots as reality itself bent to his incomprehensible will. Nurgle, the plague father, spreading his gifts of decay and corruption with the twisted love of a parent tending diseased children. Yet it was the absence that struck them most profoundly, a hollow space in the fabric of the warp where something vast and terrible should have existed, but did not. The psychic resonance there carried echoes of what might have been, a prince of pleasure and pain, a deity born from the depths of Eldar excess that would have claimed the souls of an entire species as its birthright. Magnus felt the bile rise in his throat as he grasped the full implications. You were going to create another of them. Your entire civilization was on the verge of spawning a fifth chaos god. We were, Eldrad confirmed, his ancient voice carrying shame that had been earned through millennia of contemplation. Our corruption ran so deep, our pursuit of sensation so absolute, that we stood ready to birth she who thirsts into existence. Only the intervention of those few who still retained wisdom prevented the catastrophe. Warlock Eldarath, his consciousness joined with the investigation matrix, projected images of what the birth would have meant. They saw the eye of terror tearing reality apart as the new god's arrival shattered the barrier between dimensions. They witnessed the psychic shockwave that would have claimed every Eldar soul in the galaxy, feeding the newborn deity with the life force of its creators. They observed the ripple effects that would have followed, demon incursions across human space, the complete collapse of interstellar travel as warp storms raged unchecked, the transformation of entire sectors into realms where physics held no meaning and nightmare was the only law. The timing was not coincidental, realized Magnus, as the full scope of the averted disaster became clear. Your reformation calmed the warp storms that had isolated humanity for millennia. If your corruption had reached fruition instead, those storms would have become permanent, trapping every human world in isolation until they fell to despair or madness. The revelation hung in the chamber's air like a physical weight, pressing down upon every consciousness present. Both species had known they faced dangers in the galaxy, hostile aliens, resource conflicts, the inevitable entropy that claimed all civilizations eventually. Yet neither had understood that they existed in a universe where their very thoughts and emotions could give birth to entities capable of consuming reality itself. Chief Librarian Ahriman found his voice first, though it carried a tremor that spoke of a mind stretched to its limits. If such beings exist, feeding on the psychic emanations of all sentient life, then every war, every act of excess or despair, every moment of unchecked emotion strengthens them. We are not merely fighting for territory or resources. We are fighting for the right to exist without empowering our own destroyers. The implications began to cascade through both civilizations like wildfire. On Terra, the Emperor himself felt the psychic resonance of the discovery through his connection to Magnus, and for the first time in millennia, the master of mankind experienced something approaching genuine fear. Not for himself, but for the species he had sworn to protect against threats they had never imagined. Across the Eldar craft worlds, emergency councils convened as the news spread through the Infinity Circuits. The paths they had embraced were not merely philosophical constructs designed to provide structure and meaning. They were weapons of war against entities that sought to corrupt the very essence of consciousness itself. The anti-chaos protocols that emerged from these discoveries represented a fundamental shift in how both civilizations approached every aspect of existence. Imperial psychers underwent intensive retraining in techniques that the Eldar had developed to prevent psychic resonance from feeding the dark powers. Meditation practices that emphasized discipline over raw power became mandatory for all who wielded abilities beyond the mundane. On Prospero, Magnus established the first Temple of Vigilance, where human and Eldar psychers worked together to monitor the warp for signs of chaos incursion. The hybrid techniques they developed combined Imperial strength with Eldar finesse, creating detection networks that could identify demon activity across entire sectors. "We must become gardeners of consciousness," Magnus declared to the assembled masters of both species. "Every thought, every emotion, every act of will must be weighed against its potential to feed the entities that would consume us all. This is not oppression of the spirit, but its liberation from the chains of unknowing complicity." Yet even as the Alliance strengthened against the newly understood threat, darker revelations began to surface. The corruption that had been driven from Eldar space during the Great Purification had not simply vanished. It had adapted, evolved, found new forms that were in some ways more dangerous than what had come before. Ranger Aradrian brought the first reports from the deep webway, where his patrols had encountered evidence of activity in passages that should have remained sealed. The traces they found spoke not of the pleasure-drunk excess that had once threatened to birth Slanesh, but of something colder and more calculating, a corruption that had learned from its near defeat and emerged as something entirely new. "They call themselves the Dark Eldar now," he reported to a joint session of the Council of Renewal and Imperial Command Staff. "Prince Vect has used his exile to transform his followers into something that feeds not on pleasure, but on the suffering of others. Where our ancestors pursued sensation for its own sake, these creatures have learned to harvest agony as a source of power." The implications struck both species like a physical blow. The Proto-Drukhari represented everything the Reformation had sought to prevent, but twisted into an even more dangerous form. Where the old corruption had been chaotic and self-destructive, this new variant was organized, purposeful, and actively malevolent. Farsia Kalin stood before the assembled leaders, her ancient features grave as she delivered the final piece of the puzzle. "They have made pacts with the dark powers, not to serve them, but to feed them in exchange for protection from consumption. Every act of torture, every moment of carefully crafted suffering, sends psychic energy into the warp that strengthens chaos while sustaining their own unnatural existence." The shadow war that both civilizations had hoped to avoid was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. The Drukhari would not remain content with their hidden enclaves. They would emerge to harvest the suffering of both human and Eldar populations, feeding the very entities that the Alliance sought to starve through discipline and vigilance. Yet the revelation also brought opportunity. For the first time, both species understood the true nature of the threat they faced. The enemy was not merely another alien race seeking territory or resources, but corruption itself, the temptation to abandon wisdom in favor of easy power, to choose sensation over restraint, to feed the darkness rather than kindle the light. The Chaos Gods existed because sentient beings allowed them to exist through choices made in moments of weakness or despair. Yet if consciousness could create such entities, it could also choose to deny them sustenance. The reformation of Eldar society and the discipline imposed by imperial structure were not merely administrative necessities, but weapons in a war for the very soul of the galaxy. As the investigation concluded, and the assembled minds withdrew from their deep communion with the warp's hidden truths, Magnus and Eldrad remained behind for a final exchange. The Primarch and the Farseer faced each other across a gulf measured not in physical distance, but in the weight of what they had discovered. "We stand at a crossroads," Magnus observed, his psychic voice heavy with the burden of knowledge. "Every choice we make from this moment forward will determine not just the fate of our species, but the nature of reality itself." Eldrad's response carried the wisdom of ages spent contemplating the price of existence. "The crossroads has always been there, Lord Magnus. We have simply learned to see it clearly. The question now is whether we possess the strength to choose the harder path when the easier one promises such immediate rewards." The war against chaos had begun not with armies or fleets, but with the moment of recognition that such a war was necessary. Both species now understood that their greatest enemy was not external but internal, the capacity within every thinking being to feed the very forces that sought their destruction. Whether that understanding would prove to be salvation or merely delayed damnation remained to be written in the stars themselves, where consciousness and chaos danced their eternal ballet of creation and corruption. Chapter 8. The Great Work. The construction of the Vigilance Network began not with ceremony or grand proclamation, but with the quiet labor of minds that had gazed into the abyss and chosen to build walls against the darkness. On 1,000 worlds across both Eldar and human space, teams of psychers and technicians worked to install monitoring stations that would serve as early warning systems against the corruption that dwelt beyond the veil of reality. Magnus the Red stood in the primary coordination chamber on Prospero, his crimson armor gleaming as psychic energies flowed through the massive crystal arrays that would serve as the network's central nodes. Around him, Eldar warlocks and human librarians worked in perfect harmony, their combined consciousness weaving patterns of detection that could sense the approach of demon incursions across galactic distances. "The principle is elegant," observed Warlock Eldorath, as he calibrated a resonance matrix that would monitor psychic disturbances in the segmentum solar. Where individual psychers might be overwhelmed by the dark power's influence, a distributed network can share the burden across thousands of minds, preventing any single point of failure. Chief Librarian Ahriman studied the tactical displays that showed the network's expanding coverage, each new station adding another layer of protection against the entities that fed on consciousness itself. Yet the coordination required is staggering. We are essentially creating a psychic nervous system that spans the galaxy, with each component responding to threats detected anywhere within its range. The technical challenges were immense. Human psychers, trained for raw power and direct application of will, had to learn the Eldar techniques of subtle manipulation and harmonic resonance. Eldar Farseers, accustomed to individual excellence and personal mastery, had to adapt to the human approach of standardized procedures and collective action. On the Forge world of Lucius, Tech Magos Call worked alongside Bonizinger Iriel to create hybrid technologies that could bridge the gap between Imperial machinery and Eldar Wraithbone construction. The monitoring stations that emerged from their collaboration were marvels of engineering that combined mechanical precision with living responsiveness. "Your devices think," Iriel observed, as he watched a newly installed monitoring array automatically adjusting its sensitivity based on local psychic conditions. Not with consciousness as we understand it, but with purpose that adapts to changing circumstances. Cowell's response carried the reverence that all tech adepts felt when confronting truly superior design. "And your wraithbone grows according to need, rather than predetermined specifications. Together, we have created instruments that can evolve to meet threats we have not yet encountered." The integration of Psyker training programs represented an even greater revolution. On Titan, where the Emperor's own Chosen worked in the deepest secrecy, human Psykers underwent intensive instruction in the Eldar disciplines that emphasized control over raw power. The transformation was remarkable. Where once human Psykers had been weapons pointed at the galaxy's enemies, they were becoming guardians, trained to recognize and counter the subtle corruptions that preceded demon incursion. Farsia Kalin stood in the training halls of the Imperial Palace, her ancient wisdom guiding human minds that burned with potential but lacked the discipline to use it safely. The exercises she taught bore little resemblance to the crude power displays that had previously marked human psychic development. "Strength without wisdom is merely another form of weakness," she explained to a class of librarians who struggled to master the meditation techniques that formed the foundation of Eldar psychic practice. "The dark powers do not fear your ability to level mountains. They feast on the pride that such displays engender. True strength lies in the power to choose restraint, even when destruction would be easier." Epistolary Tigrius of the Ultramarines found his perspective fundamentally altered by the training. Where once he had seen his psychic abilities as weapons to be wielded against the Emperor's enemies, he now understood them as instruments of protection that required careful maintenance and constant vigilance. "We have been taught to think like soldiers," he confided to his training partner, Warlock Korath of Ulthwe. "Yet this war requires us to think like healers, seeking to preserve rather than destroy." The Eldar warrior's response carried the weight of millennia spent walking the knife's edge between salvation and damnation. "All war is ultimately about preservation, young Monke. The question is whether we preserve what is worthy or merely what is familiar." The construction of the webway stabilization nodes represented the most ambitious engineering project either civilization had ever attempted. Massive structures that existed partially in real space and partially in the interdimensional tunnels that connected distant stars. These installations served as anchoring points that could prevent chaos incursions from tearing holes between dimensions. On the world of Cardia, where the barrier between real space and the warp had always been thin, teams of human and Eldar engineers worked to install the first of the great stabilization arrays. The device itself was a marvel of hybrid technology, Imperial durability supporting Eldar elegance, human mass production techniques creating components that Eldar craftsmanship would never have been able to supply in sufficient quantities. Autarch Iriel of Iandan supervised the installation with the focused intensity of one who understood that failure here could doom both civilizations. "The stress patterns are within acceptable parameters," he reported to the Joint Command Center, as the massive crystalline matrix was lowered into position. The node should be operational within 6 standard hours. Yet it was Captain Dawn of the Imperial Fists who recognized the broader implications of what they were building. "We are not merely creating defensive installations," he observed, as he watched the node's activation sequence begin. "We are reshaping the galaxy itself, creating stable corridors through dimensions that have never known order." The first test of the network's capabilities came sooner than anyone had hoped. Monitoring stations in the Ghoul stars detected the distinctive psychic signature of a developing demon incursion, reality itself beginning to weaken as entities from the warp sought to tear through the barrier between dimensions. The response was immediate and coordinated. Alert signals flashed through the vigilance network, reaching psychers and military commanders across 3 sectors in the space of minutes. For the first time in galactic history, a chaos incursion would be met, not with desperate improvisation, but with prepared defenses and unified strategy. Magnus the Red himself led the intervention force that materialized through webway gates within hours of the initial detection. Behind him came a mixed formation unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Imperial space marines fighting alongside Eldar aspect warriors, human psychers supporting Eldar warlocks, 2 civilizations united in purpose against an enemy that threatened them both. The battle for Zerion Prime lasted only 6 hours, but its implications would echo across the millennia. The demon incursion that should have consumed an entire star system was contained to a single world, then systematically eliminated by forces that understood both the nature of their enemy and the most effective methods for its destruction. Brother Captain Sigismund led his imperial fists into the heart of the corruption, their blessed weapons carving through lesser demons, while dire avengers provided covering fire with shuriken that had been consecrated through Eldar ritual. Above them, fire dragons and devastator squads coordinated their firepower against the greater demons that sought to anchor the incursion in real space. Yet it was the psychic intervention that proved most decisive. Human librarians and Eldar farseers working in perfect harmony managed to close the warp rifts before they could fully stabilize, denying the demons the foothold they needed to complete their manifestation. Remarkable, breathed Epistolary Tigrius as he watched the last of the warp rifts collapse under the combined psychic assault. Individual effort would have taken days to achieve what we accomplished in hours. The coordination multiplies our effectiveness exponentially. Farseer Eldrad's response carried the satisfaction of one who had witnessed the first successful test of principles learned through bitter experience. This is what cooperation can achieve when guided by wisdom rather than mere expedience. We have not merely won a battle, we have proven that victory against such enemies is possible. The establishment of the joint military orders that followed represented the formal acknowledgement of what had already become practical necessity. The Grey Knights of the Imperium and the Swords of Vol from the Eldar craft worlds would train together, fight together, and share the terrible burden of knowledge that came with understanding the true nature of their enemy. On Titan, in chambers where human and Eldar architecture blended seamlessly, the first mixed companies took their oaths of service. Space Marines knelt alongside aspect warriors, their vows witnessed by representatives of both species and blessed by powers that transcended the limitations of individual faith. We are no longer merely human or Eldar, declared Grand Master Janus, as he administered the oath to the first graduating class. We are guardians of consciousness itself, sworn to protect the light of reason against the darkness that would consume all thought. The ceremonies were solemn rather than celebratory, for all present understood the magnitude of what they had undertaken. They were not merely soldiers fighting for territory or ideology, but shepherds protecting the very essence of sentient existence against forces that sought to corrupt it beyond recognition. Yet even as the great work progressed and the galaxy's defenses grew stronger, shadows moved in the spaces between dimensions. The Drukhari had not been idle during the months of construction and coordination. Prince Vect's forces had used the distraction of the massive building project to establish new strongholds in forgotten corners of the webway, preparing for conflicts that would test the Alliance's resolve in ways no demon incursion could match. The first successful prevention of demon incursion had proven that cooperation between human and Eldar was not merely possible, but devastatingly effective. The question now was whether that cooperation would survive the challenges posed by enemies who understood both civilizations' weaknesses and had spent decades planning to exploit them. The great work continued, each day bringing new installations online and new capabilities to the growing network of defenders. Yet those who labored on the project understood that they were not merely building defenses, but racing against time itself. Somewhere in the darkness, corruption was adapting to match their efforts, and the true test of what they had built would come not in the controlled environment of a training exercise, but in the crucible of absolute necessity. The galaxy was changing, shaped by the will of those who had chosen wisdom over power and cooperation over dominance. Whether that change would prove lasting or merely a brief respite before greater darkness remained to be written in the spaces between stars, where consciousness and chaos continued their eternal dance of creation and destruction. Chapter 9. The Horus Heresy Alternative. The corruption began not with wounds infected by demon blades or whispered promises from dark priests, but with visions of a galaxy united under the banner of perfect cooperation. On the world of Davin, where the sons of Horus had come to quell a rebellion that should have been routine, Warmaster Horus Lupercal found himself facing temptations more subtle than any the Chaos Gods had previously attempted. The lodge that gathered in the temple's depths bore little resemblance to the crude warrior cults that usually served the dark powers. Here, learned men spoke not of blood and skulls, but of order and enlightenment. Their words painted pictures of a future where humanity and the Eldar would stand as equals, sharing knowledge and power in an alliance that could bring peace to every corner of the galaxy. "You have seen what cooperation can achieve," the lodge's speaker intoned, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with truths Horus had witnessed firsthand. The combined fleets crush every enemy. The shared knowledge solves problems that have plagued both species for millennia. Yet you remain subordinate to a father who shares power with aliens while denying it to his own sons. Horus felt the words strike deeper than any blade, for they carried within them seeds of doubt that his own experiences had planted. He had watched Magnus work as an equal with Eldar Farseers, while the other Primarchs remained excluded from the highest councils. He had seen Eldar Autarchs treated with the same respect accorded to Imperial generals, while he himself was still bound by oaths of fealty that seemed increasingly outdated in this new age of cooperation. The visions that followed were masterworks of corruption disguised as revelation. Horus saw himself not as a rebel against his father's will, but as the architect of humanity's true ascension. In the images that filled his mind, he stood at the head of a grand alliance, where humans and Eldar worked together as partners rather than the current arrangement, where humanity seemed to be the junior member, despite its greater numbers and expanding territory. Yet the corruption that sought to claim the War Master had not counted on the vigilance of allies who understood the nature of such temptations. On distant Ulthwe, Farseer Eldrad felt the psychic disturbance that marked a major chaos working, his consciousness reaching across the galaxy to touch the edges of a plot that threatened to undo everything both civilizations had built together. The warning that flashed through the vigilance network carried urgency that made even the most disciplined operators pause in their duties. Priority alerts reached Terra, Prospero, and every major Eldar craft world simultaneously, speaking of corruption that targeted not random psychers or isolated worlds, but the very heart of the Imperial command structure. Magnus the Red materialized in the Emperor's throne room through a webway gate that blazed with barely contained power, his crimson armor gleaming as he brought word of the threat that even now sought to turn brother against father. Behind him came Eldrad himself, the ancient Farseer's presence in the heart of the Imperial Palace, marking the gravity of what they faced. "The dark powers move against Horus," Magnus reported, his psychic voice carrying harmonics of urgency that made the very air vibrate with tension. Yet this is not the crude corruption they have attempted before. They offer him not power over others, but partnership with the Eldar that seems more attractive than his current position. The Emperor's golden gaze fixed upon Eldrad with intensity that would have destroyed lesser minds. "You have foreseen this. What did your visions reveal of the War Master's choice?" Eldrad's response carried the weight of prophecy, tinged with genuine uncertainty. "The paths diverge here more sharply than at any point since your species' first contact with ours. In some futures, Horus remains loyal and the alliance grows stronger. In others, he falls to corruption and takes half your legions with him. But in the darkest visions, he believes himself to be saving humanity from subordination to alien influence, not realizing he serves powers that would devour both our species. The intervention that followed was unlike anything in the annals of either civilization, where the canon timeline would see a father confront a fallen son in desperate battle. Here 3 of the galaxy's greatest minds worked together to save a soul that balanced on the knife's edge between salvation and damnation. The confrontation took place not on Davin's surface, but in the depths of the warp itself, where the Chaos Gods had thought themselves beyond reach of mortal interference. The Emperor, Magnus, and Eldrad joined their consciousness in a trinity of purpose that shone like a star in the realm of nightmare, their combined will cutting through illusion to reveal the true nature of the temptation Horus faced. The War Master found himself standing in a space that existed between realities, surrounded by figures whose presence filled him with both awe and sudden clarity. The whispered promises that had seemed so reasonable moments before now revealed themselves as the machinations of entities whose hatred for both humanity and the Eldar burned with the fury of thwarted hunger. "My son," the Emperor spoke, his voice carrying not the distant authority Horus had grown to resent, but the warmth of a father who had watched his child's struggles and understood them. "I have never intended for humanity to become subordinate to our alien allies. The partnership we have built is meant to elevate both species, not diminish either." Magnus stepped forward, his psychic presence radiating the brotherhood that had always existed between the Primarchs despite their differences. "The dark powers would have you believe that cooperation is weakness, that sharing knowledge diminishes rather than multiplies its power. Yet every victory we have achieved against chaos has come through unity, not division. It was Eldrad who delivered the final revelation that shattered the corruption's hold. With a gesture that made reality itself seem to ripple, he showed Horus the true future that awaited a galaxy where humanity and Eldar worked as genuine partners, not a future where humans served alien masters, but one where both species transcended their individual limitations to become something greater than either could achieve alone. "You have been shown a false choice," the Farseer said, his ancient voice carrying the wisdom of ages spent contemplating the price of pride. "The corruption whispers that you must choose between loyalty to your father and respect for your achievements. Yet the truth is that your father's greatest achievement is recognizing that even gods can learn from their children." The psychic battle that raged around them as Horus made his choice was felt across the galaxy. On 1,000 worlds, monitoring stations registered fluctuations in the warp that spoke of vast powers locked in conflict. Yet where the canonical heresy would begin with betrayal and corruption, this confrontation ended with revelation and renewed purpose. Horus emerged from the ordeal, not weakened by near corruption, but strengthened by understanding. The doubts that had made him vulnerable to chaos influence were addressed not through denial, but through genuine change in how the Alliance operated. The Primarchs would have greater involvement in strategic decisions. The partnership with the Eldar would be restructured to emphasize humanity's growing maturity rather than their need for alien guidance. Yet the Chaos Gods' fury at being denied their greatest prize was not easily contained. Across the galaxy, other servants of the Dark Powers moved to exploit the disruption, seeking to turn the prevented corruption into an opportunity for more direct assault. The rebellion that erupted was different from the Horus heresy of canon in both scope and nature. Where the original would see brother fight brother in civil war that nearly destroyed the Imperium, this version saw corrupted forces from outside the main Imperial structure attempt to exploit the moment of vulnerability while the War Master's loyalty was restored. The Siege of Terra, when it came, was not a battle between father and son, but a desperate defense against enemies who had nothing left to lose. Demon princes who had expected to feast on the corruption of Horus found themselves facing a united front that their strategies had not anticipated. The Dark Mechanicus, followers of Chaos who had infiltrated the Mechanicum, launched their prepared betrayals only to discover that their timing was catastrophically wrong. The Eldar response to the crisis demonstrated the strength of the Alliance in ways that no previous cooperation had achieved. When the alarm reached the craft worlds that Terra itself was under assault, every loyal Eldar force capable of rapid deployment answered the call without hesitation. Through webway gates that opened in the Imperial Palace itself came aspect warriors, whose fury burned not for their own grievances, but for the defense of principles that transcended species loyalty. Dire avengers fought alongside Imperial fists on the palace walls, their shuriken catapults singing in harmony with human bolters as they repelled waves of demon things that sought to corrupt the very heart of human civilization. The battle's turning point came when Magnus and Eldrad, working in perfect synchronization, managed to close the primary warp rifts that the enemy had torn in Terra's skies. Where individual effort might have taken days and cost countless lives, their combined psychic might sealed the breaches in hours, denying the demon legions the reinforcements they needed to overwhelm the defenders. Brother Captain Sigismund fought alongside Autarch Iriel in the throne room's outer chambers, their weapons carving through blood letters and pink horrors with precision that spoke of training exercises transformed into deadly reality. Around them, Space Marines and Aspect Warriors moved with the fluid coordination that had been practiced in dozens of joint operations. "They fight like us," Sigismund voxed to his battle brothers as he watched striking scorpions emerge from concealment to eliminate a demon assault team. Not like aliens fighting alongside us, but like brothers who happened to wear different armor. The victory, when it came, was absolute in ways that the canonical siege of Terra could never achieve. The Chaos forces were not merely defeated, but utterly routed, their corruption purged from Terra by combined Imperial and Eldar efforts that left no hiding places for future subversion. Yet the true triumph was not military but spiritual. The crisis had tested the alliance between human and Eldar in the crucible of absolute necessity, and found it stronger than either species had dared hope. Trust forged in desperate battle created bonds that would endure for millennia to come. In the aftermath, as both civilizations began the process of hunting down the remaining Chaos cultists who had supported the failed rebellion, Horus stood before his father in the throne room, where they had so recently fought, side by side, against extinction itself. "I was blind to what we had built," the War Master admitted, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won understanding. "I saw partnership and mistook it for subordination. I confused cooperation with weakness." The Emperor's response came not with the judgment that might have been expected, but with the understanding of one who had also learned from the crisis. "We have all been learning, my son. The alliance with the Eldar has changed us in ways we did not anticipate. Perhaps it is time to acknowledge that change and build upon it rather than merely enduring it." The reforms that followed transformed both civilizations. The Primarchs gained the involvement in strategic planning that Horus's near corruption had revealed they needed. The Eldar alliance evolved from a partnership of convenience into a true sharing of power and responsibility that honored the contributions of both species. Most importantly, the failed corruption attempt served as a vaccine against future chaos influence. Both humans and Eldar now understood the subtle ways in which the dark powers could exploit even noble desires for the common good. The vigilance that had saved Horus became a permanent feature of the alliance, ensuring that such corruption would never again come so close to success. The Chaos Gods had gambled their remaining influence on a single decisive strike, seeking to turn the alliance's greatest strength into its fatal weakness. Their failure marked not just the preservation of cooperation between the species, but its transformation into something that even gods would struggle to corrupt. The Shadow War against chaos had claimed its greatest victory, but both civilizations understood that eternal vigilance was the price of the freedom they had preserved. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility, but always shadowed by the knowledge that forces beyond mortal understanding would never cease their efforts to drag consciousness itself back into the darkness from which it had emerged. Chapter 10. Builders of Empire. The Council Chamber of New Harmony represented something unprecedented in galactic history, a space where human and Eldar representatives met not as separate civilizations negotiating treaties, but as partners in a shared enterprise that spanned the stars. Built in the months following the failed Chaos assault on Terra, the station hung in the void between Imperial and Eldar space, its hybrid architecture serving as a symbol of cooperation that had evolved beyond mere alliance into something approaching true unity. Farseer Eldrad sat across the crystalline table from War Master Horus. Their discussion focused not on the division of conquered territories, but on the integration of governmental structures that could accommodate the needs of both species. Around them, representatives from dozens of worlds brought perspectives shaped by centuries of separate development and decades of growing cooperation. The traditional imperial approach of planetary governors, answerable only to Terra, becomes problematic when many of our worlds now host significant Eldar populations, Horus observed, his tactical mind grappling with administrative challenges that no previous War Master had faced. Yet the Eldar path system requires flexibility that our rigid hierarchies struggle to accommodate. Eldrad's response carried the weight of wisdom earned through millennia of governing a species whose individual excellence often conflicted with collective needs. Perhaps the solution lies not in choosing between your structure and ours, but in creating something new that serves both. Your efficiency in resource allocation, paired with our understanding of long-term consequences, could produce governance more effective than either approach alone. The joint governance structures that emerged from these deliberations represented a fundamental shift in how both civilizations approached the administration of their expanding domains. Dual-species councils were established on worlds where both humans and Eldar had significant populations, with representatives chosen not through species-based voting, but through demonstration of competence in areas crucial to planetary success. On the world of Corthara Prime, where Eldar refugees from the Great Purification had established new settlements alongside human colonists, the first experimental government took shape. Governor Moral Voss, a former Imperial Guard colonel, worked alongside Path Speaker Yelindra of Saim Han to address challenges that required both human pragmatism and Eldar foresight. The mining operations in the northern continent show immediate profit potential, Governor Voss reported to the Council that oversaw their world's development. Yet our Eldar partners have identified ecological patterns that suggest such extraction could destabilize the entire ecosystem within 2 centuries. Path Speaker Yelindra studied the geological surveys with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of star systems. The minerals will remain beneath the surface, whether we extract them in 50 years or 500. Yet a dead world serves no one's interests. Perhaps we should focus on technologies that achieve our immediate needs while preserving long-term viability. The solution they developed, selective mining guided by Eldar ecological wisdom and supported by human engineering efficiency, became a model that spread across dozens of jointly administered worlds. Where human short-term focus might have led to environmental devastation, and Eldar long-term thinking might have prevented necessary development, their combination produced sustainable growth that served both species' needs. Cultural exchange programs flourished in the aftermath of the crisis, as both civilizations recognized that their survival depended not merely on military cooperation, but on genuine understanding between their peoples. On Prospero, human scholars studied alongside Eldar law-keepers in libraries that contained knowledge spanning millions of years. The humans brought questions that challenged ancient assumptions, while the Eldar provided context that prevented the repetition of historical errors. Epistolary Tigrius of the Ultramarines found his perspective fundamentally altered by his time studying with Warlock Korath in the Archive of Eternal Memory, where once he had approached psychic phenomena as forces to be controlled through will and training, he now understood them as part of a larger pattern that required cooperation rather than domination. "Your techniques are more sophisticated than ours," Tigrius admitted, as he successfully performed his first long-distance scrying without the aid of mechanical amplifiers. "Yet they require a patience that our Legion has never cultivated. How do you reconcile individual excellence with the time such mastery demands?" Korath's laugh carried notes like crystal wind chimes. "Your people measure success in decades, while we measure it in centuries. Yet perhaps the answer lies between our approaches, your urgency driving progress, our patience ensuring it endures." The most profound changes occurred in the military sphere, where the integration of Astartes and aspect warrior training created new forms of excellence that neither tradition could achieve alone. On the fortress world of Fenris, Space Marine recruits trained alongside young Eldar, who had chosen the path of the warrior, their different approaches to combat creating synthesis that transcended the limitations of either doctrine. Brother Sergeant Ranulf of the Space Wolves found himself learning from Exarch Karandras techniques that his legion's savage approach to warfare had never considered. Where the wolves had always relied on ferocity and brotherhood to overcome their enemies, the striking scorpions demonstrated how patience and precision could achieve victory with minimal casualties. "Your methods are efficient," Ranulf admitted, after watching a squad of scorpions eliminate a company of training targets without suffering a single wound. "Yet they seem to lack the fury that has made the Astartes legendary throughout the galaxy." Karandras's response came with the whisper of death itself. Fury has its place, young wolf. Yet rage that burns too hot consumes its wielder along with its targets. True strength lies in choosing the appropriate tool for each task. Sometimes the hammer, sometimes the scalpel. The hybrid companies that emerged from this training represented something entirely new in galactic warfare. Space Marines who had learned Eldar patience and precision worked alongside aspect warriors who had gained human determination and adaptability. Their first deployment against Orc raiders in the Golgotha system demonstrated capabilities that stunned observers from both civilizations. Where traditional Astartes companies might have suffered significant casualties while achieving their objectives, and Eldar forces might have achieved perfection at the cost of time and opportunity, the hybrid units struck with devastating efficiency that minimized both losses and mission duration. "They fight like weapons designed by gods," observed Captain Dawn as he reviewed the tactical recordings from Golgotha. "Every movement serves both immediate necessity and long-term strategy. This is warfare elevated to art." Yet the growing power of the human-Eldar alliance did not go unnoticed by other forces in the galaxy. In the depths of space beyond the Great Rift, ancient intelligences that had slumbered since the war in heaven began to stir with interest and concern. The Necron dynasties, whose own empire had once spanned the galaxy, detected the psychic resonances of two species working in harmony and recognized a potential threat to their eventual awakening. Silent Tomb worlds began to activate monitoring protocols that had lain dormant for 60 million years, their mechanical minds calculating the implications of cooperation between species that had once fought separately and ineffectively. The time was approaching when the Necrons would need to reassess their strategy for reclaiming the galaxy from the young races who had inherited it in their absence. In the galactic east, Tau expansion fleets detected the edge of joint human-Eldar territory and paused their advance to study a form of cooperation that their own philosophy of the greater good had never imagined possible. The ethereals who guided Tau expansion recognized that their traditional methods of incorporation and conversion would require significant adaptation when dealing with an alliance that had already achieved voluntary unity. Commander Shadowson stood on the command deck of her flagship, studying sensor readings that showed the coordination between human and Eldar fleets in ways that defied conventional tactical analysis. "They move as one mind controlling two bodies," she observed to her tactical staff. "Our models for dealing with either species separately become useless when facing such coordination." The Tyranid Hive fleets, still distant but steadily approaching from the galactic edge, began to show behavioral adaptations that suggested their collective intelligence had detected something unexpected in the galaxy's power balance. Scout organisms reported genetic signatures and psychic emanations that indicated prey species working together rather than competing for resources, a development that required new consumption strategies. Most ominously, in the depths of the warp, where the defeated Chaos Gods nursed their wounded pride, new plans began to take shape. The failure to corrupt Horus had taught them that direct assault on the Alliance's strength was futile. Yet both species still harbored weaknesses that careful manipulation might exploit. Human ambition that could be twisted into arrogance. Eldar perfectionism that could be corrupted into hubris. Prince Vekt's Drukhari forces, exiled but not destroyed, began to probe the edges of joint human-Eldar territory, with raids designed not for conquest, but for intelligence gathering. Each attack tested specific aspects of the Alliance's response, building a database of vulnerabilities that could be exploited when the time was right for a more comprehensive assault. "They grow stronger," Vect observed from his throne in the depths of Komaroz's shadow districts. Yet strength creates its own weaknesses. The more they trust each other, the more vulnerable they become to betrayal. The more they depend on cooperation, the more catastrophic becomes its failure. Yet for all the threats that gathered in the galaxy's shadows, the immediate reality was one of unprecedented prosperity and growth. Worlds that had struggled for centuries with resource shortages found themselves connected to trade networks that spanned both civilizations. Technologies that had been considered impossible by either species alone became routine when human innovation was guided by Eldar wisdom. On the world of Mordian, where the first joint research facilities had been established, new forms of medicine emerged that combined human surgical techniques with Eldar spiritual healing. Diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia yielded to treatments that addressed not just physical symptoms, but the psychic imbalances that often caused them. The life extension treatments that resulted from this research represented perhaps the most significant breakthrough in human history. Where once even the most augmented humans could expect lifespans measured in centuries, the new techniques could extend healthy existence for millennia without the spiritual costs that Eldar longevity required. "We are becoming something new," observed Tekmagos Cole, as he studied the biological data from the first successful treatments. "Not human, as we have traditionally understood the term, yet not Eldar either. Perhaps this is what evolution looks like when guided by wisdom rather than mere survival pressure." The cultural implications were staggering. Humans who could expect to live for thousands of years began to adopt planning perspectives that had previously been exclusively Eldar. Projects that would have seemed impossibly long-term to previous generations became routine investments in a future that individuals could expect to witness personally. Children born in this new age grew up speaking both Gothic and Eldar as native languages, their minds shaped by exposure to concepts that neither species had previously possessed. They moved between human and Eldar communities with ease that their parents found both encouraging and unsettling, representing a generation that might transcend the limitations that had defined both civilizations. Yet perhaps the most significant change was in how both species viewed their place in the galaxy. Where once humans had seen themselves as destined conquerors and Eldar as fading inheritors of ancient glory, they now understood themselves as partners in an enterprise that could reshape reality itself. The empire they were building together was not merely larger or more powerful than what either could achieve alone. It was fundamentally different in character, driven by principles that honored both human dynamism and Eldar wisdom. Whether that empire would prove durable enough to survive the challenges gathering in the galaxy's shadows remained to be seen, but its very existence demonstrated that cooperation between species was not merely possible, but transformative. The builders of this new empire worked not with tools of conquest, but with instruments of creation, shaping a future where the light of consciousness could burn bright enough to hold back the darkness that eternally threatened to consume it. What they were building had never existed before in galactic history, a civilization founded on the principle that diversity of perspective was strength rather than weakness, and that wisdom shared was wisdom multiplied beyond the limits of individual understanding. Chapter 11. The Tyrannid Answer. The first warning came not from scouts or border worlds, but from the deep space monitoring stations that hung in the void between galaxies, their hybrid sensors designed to detect threats that might approach from the darkness beyond the galactic rim. Monitoring Station Vigilance. 7, positioned 300 light-years beyond the eastern fringe, registered psychic disturbances unlike anything in its database. Not the chaotic emanations of warp entities, but something vast and organized that moved with the inexorable purpose of living hunger. Tech-adept Vex Corran stood before displays that showed readings his training had never prepared him to interpret. Beside him, Faser Ianna of Ianden studied the same data with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of stellar empires, her ancient features growing increasingly grave as the implications became clear. "The psychic signature is unprecedented," Vex Corran reported through the quantum entanglement communicators that linked the monitoring station to both Terra and the Craftworld flotillas. Massive, coordinated, yet fundamentally alien. It reads as if millions of minds were linked in perfect unity, but guided by an intelligence that operates according to principles we do not understand. Iana's response carried the weight of prophecy, tinged with growing horror. "I have seen echoes of this in the deepest meditations, visions that spoke of hunger, given form and purpose. This is not another chaos incursion or Xeno's empire. This is something that exists solely to consume, to transform all matter and energy into extensions of its own will." The alert that flashed through the vigilance network reached every major command center in human and Eldar space simultaneously, carrying data that transformed theoretical discussions of external threats into desperate planning for species survival. On Terra, the Emperor emerged from his laboratories to study readings that challenged every assumption about what forms intelligence could take. On Ulthwé, the entire Farseer Council convened in emergency session to peer into futures that showed only two outcomes: victory or extinction. Magnus the Red materialized in the Joint Command Center aboard New Harmony within hours of the initial detection, his psychic investigation of the approaching threat confirming the worst fears of both civilizations. "They are not merely approaching," he reported to the assembled military leadership. "They are preparing. Scout organisms probe ahead of the main force, studying our defensive patterns and technological capabilities. This enemy learns from observation and adapts its strategies accordingly." The challenge that faced the Alliance was unlike anything either species had encountered in their long histories. Where chaos corruption could be fought with discipline and spiritual strength, and where conventional enemies could be defeated through superior technology or tactics, the Tyranid hive fleets represented a form of warfare that operated according to biological principles neither civilization fully understood. Horus Lupercal stood before tactical displays that showed the approaching threat in all its terrible magnificence. Bioships the size of battle cruisers, living weapons that could adapt to any defense, and warrior organisms bred for specific tactical roles with efficiency that surpassed even the most advanced Imperial manufacturing. Yet it was the scale that truly staggered the imagination. Not a single fleet or invasion force, but an entire ecosystem of consumption that had evolved to strip galaxies bare of life. Traditional defensive strategies become meaningless against an enemy that can adapt faster than we can deploy countermeasures, Horus observed to the Joint War Council that included representatives from every loyal Craftworld and Imperial sector. Yet our alliance offers advantages that this hive mind may not have encountered before. The unpredictability that comes from two different approaches to warfare working in synthesis. The research programs that followed represented the most intensive scientific collaboration in galactic history. On the Forge world of Lucius, Eldar Bonesingers worked alongside Imperial biologist adepts to develop weapons specifically designed to exploit the Tyranid dependence on biological unity. Where individual bioweapons might be adapted to or absorbed by the Hive Fleet's evolutionary processes, weapons that disrupted the psychic coordination itself could potentially cripple entire swarms. Archmagos Call found himself studying Tyranid genetic samples alongside Bonesinger Iriel, their combined expertise creating synthesis that neither could achieve alone. Their adaptation speed is remarkable, Cowell admitted, as he observed captured organisms modifying their cellular structure in real time to resist Imperial toxins. Yet they appear vulnerable to disruption at the quantum level. Their coordination requires psychic resonance that can be interfered with. Iriel's response carried the excitement of discovery tempered by urgency. Our spirit stones contain similar resonance patterns, but inverted. Where Tyranid psychic unity seeks to absorb and transform, our technology preserves and protects. Perhaps we can create weapons that impose our pattern upon theirs, forcing dissolution rather than integration. The bioweapons that emerged from their collaboration were unlike anything either civilization had created before. Psychic viruses that could propagate through the hive mind's communication networks, disrupting coordination between different organism types. Quantum destabilizers that interfered with the biological adaptation process, forcing Tyranid organisms to waste energy on failed evolutionary attempts. Most devastatingly, consciousness bombs that could create artificial individualism within swarm organisms, breaking their unity and leaving them vulnerable to conventional weapons. Yet even as defensive preparations intensified, both civilizations understood that weapons alone would not suffice against an enemy of such magnitude. The Tyranid approach required defensive strategies that operated on a scale matching their threat, not single battles or even planetary campaigns, but coordinated resistance across multiple star systems. The Great Defensive Line that took shape over the following months represented the largest military construction project in galactic history. Spanning 12 star systems along the eastern fringe, the fortifications combined Imperial durability with Eldar precision, creating defensive networks that could channel Tyranid advances into predetermined killing grounds while providing fallback positions if any single system fell. Autarch Iriel of Ianden oversaw the construction of the primary fortress world at Macraga, where orbital defense platforms merged seamlessly with planetary shield generators and ground-based weapons arrays. Around him, Space Marines and Aspect Warriors worked together to create defensive positions that could withstand assault from bioships while providing clear firing lanes for counterattack. The enemy's strength lies in overwhelming force applied with precision, Iriel explained to the mixed garrison that would defend the system. Yet their precision depends on unity of purpose. If we can disrupt their coordination while maintaining our own, their greatest advantage becomes their greatest vulnerability. The test of these theories came sooner than anticipated when Tyranid vanguard organisms began probing the outer systems 6 months ahead of the main hive fleet's projected arrival. These scouting forces, though small by Tyranid standards, still numbered in the millions and moved with coordination that made conventional tactical responses inadequate. Captain Calgar of the Ultramarines found himself commanding defensive operations that included not just his own battle brothers, but dire avengers whose tactical doctrine emphasized precision over the Astartes' preference for decisive assault. The first engagements taught both forces valuable lessons about fighting an enemy that learned from every encounter. They adapt to our weapons within hours, Calgar reported, after the third probe was repelled with heavier casualties than the first 2. Bolt rounds that were effective yesterday produce only minor wounds today. Yet the Eldar disruption weapons continue to achieve consistent results. Their biological adaptation cannot compensate for psychic interference. The coordination that developed between human and Eldar forces during these preliminary engagements proved crucial when the main hive fleets finally arrived. The bioships that emerged from the depths of space dwarfed anything in the Imperial Navy, their living hulls writhing with weapon organisms that defied conventional understanding of naval warfare. The Battle of the Macragge system lasted for 6 standard months, as waves of Tyranid organisms crashed against defensive lines that bent but did not break. Imperial firepower held the line, while Eldar precision struck at command organisms. Human determination provided the will to continue fighting, even when casualties mounted beyond sustainable levels, while Eldar foresight identified the crucial moments when tactical flexibility could turn potential defeat into strategic advantage. Brother Captain Sicarius led his company in a desperate assault on a bioship that had broken through the orbital defenses, his ultramarines fighting through corridors of living flesh alongside striking scorpions, whose stealth capabilities allowed them to reach the vessel's nerve centers. The coordination required was absolute. Any failure of communication or timing would result in the entire strike force being absorbed by the ship's immune systems. "The beast learns," Sicarius voxed to his Eldar allies as they carved through defensive organisms that adapted to their weapons with each passing minute. "But it cannot learn faster than we can strike when we strike together." Exarch Carandras's response came with the whisper of death itself. "Unity of purpose, Brother Marine. Their coordination is perfect but inflexible. Ours is imperfect but adaptable. Today we discover which principle proves stronger." The destruction of the bioship's central ganglia by combined Imperial and Eldar forces marked the turning point of the battle. Without coordination from their command organisms, millions of Tyranid creatures found themselves operating on conflicting behavioral patterns, their evolutionary advantages becoming disadvantages as different caste types began attacking each other instead of the defenders. Yet victory came at a price that sobered even the most optimistic strategists. Entire Space Marine companies had been consumed in the fighting. Craft-world populations that had survived for millennia were reduced to scattered remnants. Planets that had stood for thousands of years were stripped to bedrock by feeding frenzies that defied every attempt at containment. The memorial ceremonies that followed brought together survivors from both species in recognition that their victory had been purchased through sacrifices that transcended the boundaries between human and Eldar. In the ruins of Macraga's primary hive city, Space Marines and Aspect Warriors stood together as names were read of those who had given their lives to ensure that consciousness itself would survive the hunger from beyond the stars. Farseer Eldrad spoke for all present when he delivered the eulogy that would be remembered for millennia to come. They died not as humans or Eldar, but as guardians of the light that burns within all thinking beings. Their sacrifice ensures that the galaxy will continue to know wisdom, beauty, and hope rather than only hunger. The strategic implications of the Tyranid defeat resonated across the galaxy. For the first time, an extragalactic threat had been met and defeated, not through the strength of individual civilizations, but through cooperation that created capabilities neither could achieve alone. The victory proved that the alliance between human and Eldar was not merely convenient, but necessary for survival against threats that individual species couldn't withstand. Yet even as celebrations marked the successful defense, intelligence reports began arriving that spoke of other hive fleets approaching from different vectors. The victory at Macraga had eliminated one tendril of a vast organism that spanned the space between galaxies. The war against the Great Devourer was far from over, but the Alliance had proven that such wars could be won. The weapons and tactics developed during the campaign became standard equipment for both civilizations, creating military doctrines that assumed cooperation rather than merely allowing for it. Joint training programs expanded to ensure that every Space Marine company included Eldar advisors, while every Aspect Warrior shrine maintained liaisons with Imperial forces. Most importantly, the shared trauma and triumph of the Tyranid War created bonds between human and Eldar that transcended the formal agreements that had initiated their alliance. Veterans who had fought together against the hunger from beyond the stars carried understanding that no diplomatic protocol could duplicate, the knowledge that their species' survival depended not on individual excellence, but on their willingness to stand together against the darkness. The galaxy had faced extinction and emerged strengthened rather than weakened. The alliance, forged in the crucible of necessity, had proven itself in the furnace of absolute testing. Yet those who had witnessed the true scale of the Tyranid threat understood that vigilance could never be relaxed. Somewhere in the void between galaxies, other hive fleets continued their inexorable approach, and only unity could ensure that consciousness would prevail over consumption. The answer to the Tyranid question had been written in blood and sacrifice across a dozen star systems. But the answer was clear. Cooperation between species was not merely possible, but essential for survival in a universe where extinction was always one failed defense away. Chapter 12. Eternal Guardians. 1,000 years had passed since the first tentative contact between reformed Eldar and emerging humanity, and the galaxy bore little resemblance to the divided realm that had once known only war and entropy. From the observation deck of the Eternal Vigilance, flagship of the combined exploration fleet that prepared to venture beyond the galactic rim, Farseer Admiral Yaelindra of the third generation gazed upon stars that knew peace not as a brief respite between conflicts, but as the natural state of civilized existence. Her companion, Chapter Master Aurelius of the Custodian Eagles, represented the culmination of a millennium's worth of integrated training and shared wisdom. His enhanced physiology bore the marks of both Astartes genecraft and Eldar longevity treatments, while his mind had been shaped by educational traditions that drew from both species' accumulated knowledge. Together, they embodied what the Alliance had achieved, not the merger of human and Eldar into some hybrid species, but the elevation of both through partnership that preserved their essential natures while transcending their individual limitations. The monitoring stations report complete stability across all sectors, Aurelius observed, as he studied displays that showed the galaxy-wide network that had evolved from those first experimental installations on the eastern fringe. No chaos incursions in over 2 centuries, orc populations contained within designated reservation systems, Tyranid approach vectors monitored and interdicted before they can establish footholds. Yaelindra's response carried the satisfaction of one who had witnessed the patient work of generations bearing fruit. The Vigilance Network has become more than we dared hope, not merely an early warning system, but a stabilizing influence that maintains cosmic order through conscious will rather than random chance. The institutions that governed the galaxy reflected a maturation of cooperation that had begun with desperate necessity and evolved into genuine synthesis. The High Council of Terra Ulthwé met in chambers that existed simultaneously on the human homeworld and the greatest Eldar craft world, their sessions conducted through psychic resonance that allowed representatives to participate regardless of physical location. Decisions that affected billions of lives were made not through dominance of one species over another, but through consensus that honored both human dynamism and Eldar wisdom. Governor Farseer Vex Miralin of the Ultramar Biltan sector exemplified how administrative efficiency could be enhanced through long-term perspective. Her jurisdiction encompassed 300 worlds, where human and Eldar populations had grown together over centuries, creating communities that thought in terms of millennia rather than decades. Children born on these worlds spoke both Gothic and Eldar as native languages, their education encompassing scientific traditions from both civilizations and artistic sensibilities that neither could have achieved alone. Resource allocation for the next 500 years has been finalized, she reported to the Sector Council that included representatives from both species. Agricultural worlds will implement the new ecological balance protocols developed by our joint research teams, while manufacturing centers will begin production of the hybrid technologies that our exploration fleets will require for extragalactic operations. The exploration fleets themselves represented perhaps the greatest achievement of the partnership. Ships that combined Imperial durability with Eldar elegance carried crews trained in traditions that spanned both civilizations. Their mission was not conquest in the traditional sense, but expansion of consciousness itself, the carrying of light and order into regions of space that had never known the touch of civilized thought. Captain Autarch Thane of the exploration vessel. Unity's Edge stood in a command center, where human tactical displays merged seamlessly with Eldar prescience matrices. His crew included specialists from dozens of different worlds, their training encompassing everything from void combat to xenoarchaeology. They were prepared not merely to fight whatever they might encounter beyond the galaxy's edge, but to understand it and, where possible, to offer the gift of cooperation that had transformed their home from a realm of eternal war into a beacon of ordered peace. Long-range auguries detect stellar formations that match no known patterns, he reported to the Exploration Command that coordinated expeditions from both Terra and the Craftworld flotillas. Possible artificial construction on a scale that rivals the ancient Elder Empire at its height. We request permission to investigate and, if appropriate, initiate first contact protocols. The first contact protocols that had evolved over the centuries represented one of the Alliance's most sophisticated achievements. Where once each species had approached alien encounters with suspicion and often violence, the combined diplomatic corps had developed methods for communication that could bridge gaps in biology, psychology, and fundamental worldview. Their success in integrating dozens of minor xeno-species into the galactic order had proven that cooperation was not limited to human and Eldar, but could extend to any intelligence willing to embrace wisdom over dominance. The defeat of chaos, achieved through sustained vigilance rather than desperate battles, stood as testament to the power of conscious choice in shaping reality. The warp itself had changed over the centuries as billions of minds trained in discipline and cooperation created psychic currents that nourished order rather than entropy. Where once the realm beyond reality had been dominated by entities that fed on conflict and excess, now it resonated with harmonies that reflected the partnership between species working toward common goals. Magnus the Eternal, Primarch Farseer, whose unique nature embodied the fusion of human and Eldar psychic traditions, stood in the great library of Tiska Ulthwe, where the accumulated knowledge of both civilizations was preserved and expanded. His research into the fundamental nature of consciousness itself had produced insights that threatened to revolutionize understanding of what intelligence could become when freed from the limitations of individual biology. We stand on the threshold of transcendence, he observed to the gathered scholars whose ages spanned centuries and whose perspectives encompassed the wisdom of both species. The next stage of evolution is not biological, but spiritual, the development of consciousness that can exist independent of physical form while maintaining connection to the material realm. The implications were staggering. Humanity and the Eldar were not merely allied civilizations sharing the galaxy, but partners in an enterprise that could reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. The spirit stones that preserved Eldar consciousness after death had been refined to work with human souls, while Imperial technology for maintaining life had been enhanced with Eldar techniques for nurturing the spirit. Death itself was becoming not an ending, but a transformation into forms of existence that previous ages could never have imagined. Yet perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in the nature of conflict itself. Where once the galaxy had known only war as a means of resolving disputes between different groups, the partnership between human and Eldar had demonstrated that cooperation could achieve results that no amount of violence could produce. The remaining Orc populations had been contained within designated systems where they could pursue their love of combat without threatening civilian populations. The Tau Empire had been peacefully integrated into the Galactic Order after their leadership recognized the advantages of joining a successful cooperative rather than expanding through conquest. Even the Necron dynasties, awakened by the psychic resonances of galactic peace, had chosen negotiation over warfare when they realized that their goals of cosmic order aligned with what the Alliance had already achieved. The Silent King himself had entered into treaties that allowed Necron technology to contribute to the galaxy's stability, while respecting the sovereignty of species that had proven they could maintain order without mechanical dominance. The Drukhari, the last remnant of the corruption that had once nearly destroyed the Eldar Empire, persisted in their hidden enclaves, but found their influence increasingly limited as the galaxy offered fewer opportunities for the suffering they required to sustain their unnatural existence. Prince Vect's forces had been reduced to scavenging at the edges of reality, their power broken by the simple fact that a universe filled with cooperation and mutual support provided little fodder for entities that fed on pain and despair. The Shadow War is ending, not through victory in battle, but through transformation of the conditions that made it possible, reported Shadow Seer Cassandra as she delivered the final intelligence briefing on Drukhari activities. They cannot survive in a galaxy where suffering is rare and joy is common. Their own nature has become their prison. The combined fleets that prepared for extragalactic exploration carried with them not weapons of conquest, but tools of understanding. Their mission was to extend the principles that had brought peace to their home galaxy to whatever lay beyond, not through forced conversion, but through demonstration that cooperation could achieve what dominance never could. The launch ceremonies that marked the beginning of the Great Exploration took place simultaneously on 1,000 worlds, as populations that had learned to think of themselves as galactic citizens, rather than members of competing species, gathered to witness the next step in consciousness evolution. Children who had grown up knowing only peace watched starships disappear into the void, carrying the promise that whatever they encountered among distant galaxies would be met with wisdom rather than fear. Emperor Aurelius the Golden, whose title now reflected not dominance over humanity, but stewardship of the partnership between species, stood beside Eldrad the Eternal in ceremonies that merged human pageantry with Eldar spiritual resonance. Their words carried across the galaxy through communication networks that had evolved far beyond anything either civilization could have created alone. "We go not as conquerors but as gardeners," the Emperor declared, his voice reaching every world where sentient beings had learned to work together rather than fight apart. "Our mission is to plant seeds of cooperation in whatever soil we find, knowing that the harvest may not come for millennia, but trusting that consciousness, once awakened to its potential, will choose growth over destruction." Eldred's response carried the wisdom of ages spent guiding his people from the brink of extinction to partnership in the galaxy's renewal. "We have learned that the universe rewards those who choose unity over division, wisdom over power, cooperation over conquest. Let us carry that lesson to whatever intelligences await beyond the stars, offering them the same choice our peoples made long ago. The transformation was complete. The galaxy that had once known only war had become a realm where peace was maintained not through dominance, but through the conscious choice of billions of minds working in harmony. Species that had once seen each other as threats had learned to recognize diversity as strength and cooperation as the highest form of evolution. The fleets that departed for distant galaxies carried with them the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of partnership. Not the arrogance of conquerors certain of their superiority, but the humility of gardeners who had learned that the most beautiful gardens grew from the patient nurturing of many different forms of life working together in harmony. Behind them, the galaxy continued its peaceful evolution under the guidance of institutions that had learned to balance individual excellence with collective wisdom. The Vigilance Network maintained its watch not against external enemies, but against the internal tendencies that could lead any species back toward the conflicts that had once defined existence. The great libraries preserved and expanded knowledge that belonged not to any single species, but to consciousness itself. Children born in this age would know only the benefits of cooperation, their education encompassing traditions that spanned millennia and perspectives that honored both the dynamic growth humans brought to any endeavor and the patient wisdom that had allowed the Eldar to survive their own near destruction. They would be citizens not of individual worlds or species, but of a galactic civilization that had learned to see diversity as its greatest strength. The work was far from finished. Distant galaxies might hold challenges that would test the principles of cooperation in ways that home had never demanded. Yet the foundation had been laid, the proof that consciousness could choose its own evolution, that species could transcend their limitations through partnership rather than conquest, and that the universe itself responded to the will of minds that chose creation over destruction. The eternal guardians of this new age understood that vigilance would always be required, not against external enemies, but against the internal temptations that could lead any civilization back toward the darkness from which they had emerged. Yet they faced the future not with fear, but with confidence earned through centuries of proof that wisdom, patience, and cooperation could achieve what force and dominance never could. The galaxy was at peace, consciousness was expanding toward distant stars, and the future held infinite possibility, guided by the hard-won wisdom that light shared was light multiplied, and that the universe itself conspired to support those who chose unity over division in their eternal dance, with possibility and hope.